Everett Halberd didn't knock. He never knocked. He pushed open the door to the Red Mesa land office on a Tuesday morning like he owned it, which in every way that mattered in this county. He did, and he dropped a single piece of paper on the desk in front of County Clerk Mervyn Poole. The paper was a closure notice. Road 7, the old cattle road that cut along the eastern ridge, would be sealed by sundown. A locked gate, Halberd's Gate, on land that the territorial map still showed as public access. Mervyn looked at the paper. He looked at Halberd. He looked at the two men standing behind Halberd, both of them wearing guns the way some men wear watches automatically, without thought. "Mr. Halberd," Mervyn started. "That road's been open since sundown," Halberd repeated. He didn't raise his voice. He never raised his voice. He tapped the paper once with 2 fingers, like he was marking a grave, and walked out. By noon, the gate was up. By evening, 4 ranchers, who needed that road to move their cattle to market, were standing in front of it, looking at a padlock the size of a man's fist, trying to do the math on what this meant for their families. One old man on a gray horse sat at the back of the small crowd and watched. He hadn't spoken yet. He was still deciding whether this was his problem. It was about to become one. If you've ever watched a powerful man take something that wasn't his and felt that hot, helpless anger sitting in your chest with nowhere to go, you already understand this story. Stay with me. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what comes next. And leave a comment below telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Hit that like button too, because what Silas Vane did next, the choice he made in front of that locked gate, is the kind of thing people are still talking about. Let's go back to the beginning. Silas Vane rode into Red Mesa the way most men his age arrived in frontier towns quietly, without announcing himself, hoping nobody would look too closely at his face. He was somewhere north of 60, though he wouldn't say exactly where, and his body carried the record of a life that had not been gentle. His right shoulder sat slightly lower than the left, from an old break that hadn't healed straight. He moved slower getting on and off a horse than he used to. His hands still worked fine. That was the part that mattered. He'd come to Red Mesa for the same reason a lot of worn-out men came to a place someone had written him a letter. The letter was from a woman named Clara Dunn, who had been a school teacher in a town called Harwick until that town dried up, and who had relocated west to live near her daughter. Clara was not a dramatic woman. She was precise and practical, and she'd written her letter in the same voice she probably used to correct arithmetic direct. No ornamentation. "Silas, there is something wrong here. The kind of wrong that gets worse if nobody names it. I know you're done with all of that. I'm not asking you to be what you were. I'm just asking you to come and look." He'd read the letter twice, folded it, put it in his coat pocket, and then sat with it there against his chest for 3 days before saddling Ash and heading west. Told himself he was going to visit an old friend. Told himself he'd look, assess, and leave. He'd been telling himself things like that for years. Ash was a gray quarter horse of uncertain age, deeply unimpressed by everything, with the kind of bone density that made him look heavier than he was. Silas had owned him for 11 years, and they had reached the easy companionship of 2 creatures who'd spent enough time together to stop needing to prove anything. The horse didn't spook. That was his best quality. In his younger years, Silas had owned horses that were faster, horses that were better looking, horses that responded to commands like they'd been waiting their whole lives to receive them. Ash just didn't spook. At this point in Silas's life, that was enough. He came into Red Mesa on a Wednesday afternoon, and the first thing he noticed was how people moved. Not the direction they moved, the quality of it. The way a woman crossing the main street adjusted her path slightly when she saw 2 men leaning against the wall outside the general store. The way the store owner watched Silas ride from behind his window glass, but didn't come to the door to wave. The way 2 young ranch hands on horseback talked to each other in lowered voices near the livery, both of them watching the far end of the street without looking like they were watching it. A town under pressure moved like this. Silas knew the pattern because he'd seen it too many times in too many places, and because he understood in a way he couldn't entirely explain to someone who hadn't lived it that fear had a physical texture. Settled into the way people held their shoulders, the pace at which they crossed open ground, the particular quality of silence that fell when a certain kind of man walked past. He found Clara at the small boarding house she ran with her daughter on the north edge of town. The daughter, a solid young woman named Petra, who had her mother's eyes and considerably less patience, brought him coffee without being asked, and then stood in the corner of the room with her arms crossed. The way people stand when they've been waiting a long time to have a conversation and aren't sure they trust the conversation to go anywhere useful. Clara had aged since he'd last seen her. Most people had. Her hair was fully white now, and she moved carefully in a way that suggested her knees hurt, though she would have sooner cut off her own hand than said so. She poured her own coffee, settled into the chair across from him, and said, "You took 3 weeks. Letter took time to find me. It found you 2 weeks ago." He said nothing. She hadn't expected him to. "His name is Everett Halberd," she said. "He owns the Rafter H, which is the largest cattle operation in this part of the territory. He also effectively owns the bank, though his name isn't on anything there. He's been buying land for 7 years. When people won't sell, he finds other ways." "What other ways?" "Debt," Petra said from the corner, and the word came out with a particular flatness that told Silas it wasn't an abstract concept to her. "He has an arrangement with the bank. People come in for loans, fair loans, reasonable loans, loans they've been making payments on for years. And then something changes. A term in the paperwork they didn't understand. An interest clause that activates after the 3rd year. Penalty they didn't know existed. Suddenly they owe twice what they thought they owed, and they can't pay it. And Halberd's man shows up to discuss, that's the word they use. Discuss whether there's another arrangement that could be made. And the other arrangement is selling to Halberd. At 40 cents on the dollar, Clara said, sometimes less. Silas drank his coffee. It was good coffee. Clara had always made good coffee, and he took a moment with it before asking the next question. "What does the sheriff say?" The silence that followed was its own answer. Clara refilled her cup. Petra uncrossed her arms and then crossed them again. Outside, the wind moved through something, a loose board somewhere, a gate, and the sound of it was the only answer he got for a long moment. "Sheriff Beaumont has a mortgage," Clara finally said, "on a property he bought 4 years ago. The mortgage is held by the bank." Silas set down his cup. "That's tidy. That's how he does it," Petra said. "He doesn't threaten people directly. He doesn't have to. He just arranges things, positions things. And then he waits for people to understand that there's only one direction available." "And the road closure?" Clara's jaw tightened. "Road 7 is the access route for 6 ranches on the eastern ridge. Without it, they can't move cattle to market without adding 2 days of drive time through hill terrain that's barely passable in good weather. In winter, it's not passable at all." She paused. 3 of those ranches have loans through the bank. If they can't get their cattle to market on schedule, they'll miss payments. They miss payments. Halberd shows up to discuss it. Silas looked out the window at the street. A man on horseback was riding past Halberd's brand on the horse. He recognized it now, the slanted H on the left flank. The rider wasn't doing anything, just riding past, just being visible. "How long has the gate been up?" 3 days. "Who closed it?" "His men put it up. The notice was filed legally, through the land office. He had Mervyn Poole sign off on it." Mervyn. Clara pressed her lips together. "Mervyn has children." Halberd made sure Mervyn understood that. Silas was quiet for a while. The coffee cooled in the cup. Somewhere outside, a dog was barking at something, then stopped. "What do you want me to do, Clara?" She looked at him steadily. "I want you to look at a locked gate and tell me what you see." He rode out to Road 7 the next morning. Ash picked his way along the track in the early light, unhurried, and Silas let him set the pace because there was reason to hurry, and because a man arriving at something at a walk, rather than a gallop, tended to see it more clearly. The gate was exactly as Clara had described, a heavy timber frame with iron bracing, the kind of construction that said permanent rather than temporary, with a padlock that was not decorative. 2 of Halberd's men were positioned nearby, not at the gate itself, but close enough that their presence was unmistakable. They watched Silas ride up without moving. There were already 4 men at the gate when Silas arrived. 2 were ranchers he didn't know yet, 1 older, heavyset, with the particular weariness of someone who has absorbed a piece of very bad news and is still working out its full implications. 1 younger, angrier, standing with his hat in his hands and squeezing it in a way that suggested he was substituting the hat for something else. The other 2 were ranch hands, standing slightly behind their employers in the way that made clear they were there as bodies, rather than as decision-makers. Silas pulled up beside the group and looked at the gate. He looked at it the way Clara had asked him to actually looked, took it in, thought about what it meant and what it would take and what came next. The older rancher glanced over at him. "You from around here?" "Passing through. Convenient time to pass through." The man wasn't being hostile, just tired. "That road's been closed 3 days. My name's Walt Gruber." I run the broken G 6 miles up the ridge, Silas Vane. Something moved in Walt's expression, a flicker of recognition, quickly controlled. The younger man with the hat looked up sharply. One of Halberd's men near the fence shifted his weight. Silas noticed all of it. He'd spent 50 years noticing things like that. You know this gate's illegal, Silas said to no one in particular. It wasn't a question. Try explaining illegal to a padlock, Walt said. Silas looked at the gate for another moment. Then he dismounted, pulled a short pry tool from his saddlebag, the kind of thing a man carried for a dozen practical reasons on the frontier, and walked to the gate. Hey, one of Halberd's men stepped forward. What do you think you're doing? Roads public access, Silas said, working the pry bar into the mounting bracket of the lock. Has been since the territorial charter. Closure notice requires a hearing before implementation. There was no hearing. He glanced up. I read the territorial code. You touch that lock and Mr. Halberd will. The lock and its bracket came free with a sound like a small bone breaking. Silas caught the hardware before it hit the ground, held it for a moment, then set it down carefully against the fence post. Pushed the gate open with one hand. The two ranch hands from behind Walt and the young rancher were staring at him. Walt himself had gone very still. Halberd's man had his hand near his gun but hadn't touched it. His partner had taken 2 steps back, without seeming to realize he'd done it. Mr. Halberd is going to hear about this, the first man said. I expect so, Silas said, and walked back to Ash. Halberd heard about it before noon. He was at his desk in the main house of the Rafter H when his foreman, a lean, sour-faced man named Del Pruitt, came in and explained what had happened. Halberd listened, without interrupting, which was his habit, and when Pruitt was done, Halberd sat back in his chair and thought about it. He was 54 years old, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of physical authority that came not from size but from the absolute certainty he projected about his own position in every room he entered. He'd built the Rafter H from a middling operation into the dominant force in 3 counties through a combination of intelligence, patience, and a fundamental understanding that most men had limits. The trick was finding the limit, finding the particular thing that a man needed to protect or feared losing or couldn't afford, and then positioning yourself at that pressure point and waiting. Most men, when pushed to that pressure point, found a way to agree with him, not because they wanted to, but because the alternative became unthinkable. He hadn't encountered many men who genuinely didn't seem to have a pressure point. Not many. 1 or 2 across 30 years of careful positioning. Silas Vane, he said. You're sure? He said his name plain. Walt Gruber heard it. So did 2 of our boys. Halberd turned to the window. The Rafter H spread out in front of him. 3,000 acres of the best grazing land in the territory, plus the mineral rights on the eastern ridge that nobody else seemed to know about yet. He'd spent 7 years building toward a position where he could control the water, control the roads, and control the debt, the 3 levers that, together, made a man impossible to dislodge from a landscape. He was 18 months from having all 3 completely in hand. Silas Vane was 60 years old if he was a day, riding a gray horse, and had just taken apart a gate that had cost $300 to install. Send for Tolan, Halberd said. Pruitt hesitated. That'll be expensive. I know what Tolan costs. Halberd turned back from the window. Offer him $10,000. The silence in the room was total for a moment. $10,000 was not a number that got said casually. Pruitt had been working for Halberd for 9 years at a wage that would take him 40 years to accumulate $10,000. You sure you want to go straight to Toland? We could. He opened my gate, Del. Halberd said it quietly, in front of Walt Gruber and his men and my men and whoever else was standing there watching. He opened my gate and set the hardware down like it was a piece of trash. His voice hadn't changed. It was the same careful, measured voice he always used. Find Toland. Tell him 10,000. Tell him the job needs to look like it came from somewhere else. Pruitt nodded and left. Halberd went back to the window. Outside, one of his hands was working a horse in the near paddock, a young bay, skittish, not yet settled into itself. The hand was patient with it. That's how you did it. You were patient. You waited for the animal to exhaust its resistance. You didn't break it exactly. You just waited until it stopped fighting. He had never encountered a man who was truly unbreakable. He didn't believe such men existed. Silas Vane was old and alone and operating in a town where every meaningful lever of power belonged to Halberd. He just needed to find the man's limit. Bram Toland rode into the territory 4 days later from the southeast, which was where he generally came from when he came from anywhere. He was 41 years old and had been working for money since he was 19, which gave him 22 years of professional clarity about what he was and what he wasn't. He wasn't sentimental about it. He wasn't proud of it either. Pride, in his line of work, was a hazard. Pride made you do things for reasons other than money, and when you started doing things for reasons other than money, your decision-making deteriorated. He met with Del Pruitt at a way station 12 miles outside Red Mesa, because Toland never met with principals directly if he could avoid it. Pruitt laid out the job. Toland listened. When Pruitt put the envelope on the table, Toland opened it, counted it, and confirmed the arithmetic. "Who's the subject?" Toland asked. Pruitt told him. There was a pause. Not a long pause. Toland was not a man who showed much on his face, but a pause. Silas Vane. "You know him?" Toland refolded the envelope slowly. "I know of him. Most people in my line of work know of Silas Vane." He set the envelope back on the table. "Tell me what he did." Pruitt told him about the gate, about the pry bar, about the hardware set down against the fence post like a piece of trash. Toland sat with this for a moment. "He's 60 years old and alone," Pruitt said. "He's got a bad shoulder." "I know about the shoulder," Toland said. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he pushed the envelope back across the table. "I'm not taking this job." Pruitt stared at him. "That's $10,000. "I know what it is. Mr. Halberd doesn't hear no very often." "Mr. Halberd is going to hear it now," Toland said, and he said it without heat, without apology, in the same voice he'd have used to decline a second cup of coffee. He stood, pulled on his coat, picked up his hat. "Tell your man to leave Vane alone." "Why?" Pruitt was genuinely bewildered. It wasn't a challenging question, it was a searching one. "Why would you turn down $10,000 to go after one old man?" Toland looked at him for a moment. "Because I've been doing this for 22 years, he said, "and I know the difference between a man who came to touch something and a man who came to give something back." He settled his hat on his head. What that old man did with that gate, that wasn't the first move. That was the answer to somebody else's first move. You go after him, and you won't just be going after him. You'll be going after everything he represents to every person in that valley who's been waiting for someone to represent something. He paused at the door. "Your boss has been doing this for 7 years, and he's got it down to a science. But he's never once encountered a man who genuinely doesn't need anything from him. That's a different kind of problem." He pushed the door open. "I'm not your solution to it." He was gone before Pruitt could think of what to say. Pruitt rode back to the Rafter H and told Halberd what had happened. He told it straight, which was the only way Pruitt knew how to tell things. And when he finished, Halberd was quiet for a long time. "Turned down 10,000, Halberd finally said. "Yes, sir." Bram Toland turned down $10,000. "Yes, sir." Halberd stood at the window again. He did that when he was thinking, stood at the window, and looked out at what he owned and let the sight of it organize his mind. What did he say exactly about Vane? Pruitt repeated it as closely as he could. He had a good memory for conversations, which was part of why Halberd kept him. When Pruitt was done, Halberd was still quiet. The ranch hand was still working that young bay horse in the paddock below, and the horse was still fighting it, throwing its head, circling tight, not ready to settle. "Send 4 men into town tomorrow," Halberd said. "I want them visible. I want people to see them." He turned from the window. "And find me something on Vane. Old cases, old warrants, anything that followed him. If a man has been walking around for 60 years, he's left tracks somewhere." His voice was still measured, still careful. "Everybody has a limit, find his." Silas didn't know about Toland yet. He wouldn't know for 2 days. What he did know, by the end of that first week in Red Mesa, was that opening a gate with a pry bar was the easy part of what was coming. Clara had been right. There was something wrong here, a wrongness that had gone on long enough and reached deep enough that it had started to feel like weather to the people living in it, something you adapted to rather than something you tried to change. He spent those first days walking the town, talking to people when they were willing to talk, listening when they weren't. He was good at listening. He'd been good at it his whole life, and age had made him better at it because he'd stopped needing conversations to go anywhere in particular. He could sit with a man while that man worked and simply be present, and often that was enough for the man to say what he hadn't planned to say. He talked to Caleb Ward, the deputy, who was 28 years old, and had the face of a young man carrying weight that didn't belong to a face that age. Caleb wore his badge the way some men wore a coat that didn't quite fit because he needed it, not because it felt right. He talked about his job carefully, with long pauses, the way people talk when they've learned that careless words have costs. You know what's happening with those ranch loans, Silas said. They were at the livery, not because Caleb had agreed to meet him there, but because Silas had been there when Caleb came in to check on his horse, and Silas had just kept doing what he was doing, moving slowly around Ash with a brush, not looking at Caleb directly. I know what's been filed at the land office, Caleb said carefully. You know what's been filed and you know what's actually happening are two different things. A long pause. Caleb was brushing his own horse now, working through it. I'm a deputy. Sheriff Beaumont handles the sheriff has a mortgage. Caleb's brush stopped for just a moment, then started again. I'm not criticizing him, Silas said. I'm just noting it. A man with a mortgage has a point of vulnerability. Most men do. Most men have something they can't afford to lose. He moved around to Ash's other side. What about you? What about me? What? What can't you afford to lose? Question sat in the air of the livery. Somewhere, a horse shifted its weight. Caleb worked the brush in short strokes for a while before answering. I have a younger sister, he said. She's 17. Our parents are gone. She's at the schoolhouse. Clara Dunn's been letting her help out there. He stopped. Started again. If I do something that costs me this job, I don't know what happens to her. Silas nodded. He'd expected something like that, not the specifics, but the shape of it. Everyone had a shape. You know Nathan Cole, he asked. The banker? Yeah. What's he like? Caleb thought about it. Honest, he said, which surprised Silas slightly, given everything else. He got hired by the bank's board 6 years ago. I think when they hired him, they hadn't fully understood yet what Halberd wanted from the institution. By the time Nathan understood what he'd walked into, Caleb searched for the word. Positioned. Leverage? His own son took a loan 2 years ago to start a small freighting operation. The loan is through the bank. Of course it is. But Nathan Caleb seemed to be working something out while he said it. I don't think he's as far gone as Halberd thinks he is. I've watched him sign things, and I can see it costs him something. Some men, when it costs them enough, eventually stop paying. Silas put down the brush and looked at Caleb directly for the first time in the conversation. The young deputy had the kind of face that was better at feeling things than hiding them, which in this business was both a weakness and a quality. You've been thinking about this for a while, Silas said. Everybody in this town thinks about it, Caleb said. We just don't say it out loud because saying it out loud means you're serious about it, and being serious about it is dangerous, yes. Silas picked up the brush again. Well, he said, sometimes dangerous is where you end up. It was 3 days after that conversation that Del Pruitt's men came into town, 4 of them, riding together, not doing anything overtly threatening, just moving through Main Street slowly and visibly, stopping at the general store, eating at the saloon, talking to people in the way that wasn't quite a conversation, but was clearly meant to communicate something. The message was legible to anyone who could read the dialect. We're watching. We're here. Remember who this town belongs to. Silas watched from a chair in front of Clara's boarding house. He drank coffee. He didn't move. One of Halberd's men, a young one, aggressive in the particular way of young men who are paid to be aggressive, and haven't yet encountered the cost of it, came and stood in front of him. You Vane? Mr. Halberd's heard you've been asking around, talking to people. People talk, Silas said. Mr. Halberd wants you to know that Red Mesa is a quiet town. He likes it quiet. Silas looked up at the young man. He had the kind of calm that came not from having nothing to lose, but from having already weighed the losses and made his peace with them. A calm that was somehow more unsettling than anger, because anger you could match and escalate. This was something else. I expect he does, Silas said. He went back to his coffee. The young man stood there for a moment, uncertain. He'd been sent to deliver a message and he'd delivered it, but the response he'd gotten wasn't the kind of response the message was designed to receive. You delivered that kind of message, and you expected fear, or defiance, or negotiation, something to work with. An old man drinking coffee was not something to work with. He left. His 3 partners had watched from down the street. They drifted away. Clara came to the door. She'd heard it through the window. Silas. I know, they'll come back. They'll come back, he agreed. He finished his coffee. That's fine. Let them come back. He looked out at the street, at the ordinary mid-morning activity of a town that was trying to function like a normal town, while a man with 3,000 acres was slowly squeezing the life out of it. I need to talk to Nathan Cole, he said, at the bank. But not inside the bank. Clara thought about it. He takes his lunch at the saddle shop on Tuesdays. Alone, he was there this morning. Silas stood, set down the empty cup, and went to find Nathan Cole. Nathan Cole was 47, slight, with the particular pallor of a man who spent most of his time indoors with numbers. He was eating a sandwich when Silas found him and didn't look up immediately, and when he did look up, something passed across his face that was partway between recognition and calculation, and something that might have been relief if it wasn't held down by fear. "Mr. Vane," he said carefully, "you know who I am. Everybody knows who you are by now." He put down the sandwich. "Halberd's been asking about you. What have you told him?" "That I don't know you personally." A pause, which is true. Silas sat down across from him. The saddle shop was quiet at midday, the owner in the back. "I'm going to tell you something," Silas said, "and I want you to think about it before you respond. The loan documents that Halberd has been using to pressure ranchers, the ones with the hidden penalty clauses, you know what's in them." Nathan's jaw tightened. Not a denial, not a confirmation, just a tightening. "And you know that some of those documents were altered after signing," Silas continued. "Terms that weren't in the original agreements. I'm guessing you didn't do the altering yourself. But you've seen the originals and the altered versions, and you know the difference." The silence was long enough that Silas heard the wind outside, heard the creak of the sign above the saddle shop, heard Nathan's breathing change slightly. "How do you know that?" Nathan said finally very quietly. "I know because you're still there," Silas said. "A man who fully cooperated with this would have found a way to make himself not know. You know because you couldn't stop yourself from looking. And you've kept what you found somewhere safe, because you're a banker, and you understand that documentation is the only real protection." Nathan was looking at him with something that wasn't quite hope and wasn't quite terror, something suspended between the two. He stopped. "My son has I know about your son's loan," Silas said. "I'm not asking you to do anything today. I'm asking you whether what I've said is true." A very long pause. "Yes," Nathan said, almost without sound. Silas nodded. "All right," he stood up. "Don't do anything different. Don't talk to anyone about this. Go back to the bank and do exactly what you've been doing." He paused. "Don't destroy anything. Whatever you've been keeping safe, keep it safe." He left Nathan Cole with half a sandwich and a decision to sit with. By the end of that week, Silas had spoken with 6 people. Walt Gruber, who ran the Broken G and had 3 years of loan records that showed a discrepancy he hadn't known how to explain. A widow named Elena Crow, who had inherited her husband's cattle operation 2 years ago and had been fighting loan terms she was certain weren't what she'd agreed to. Caleb Ward, Nathan Cole, Clara, who had more information than anyone in the county because she ran a boarding house and people talked in boarding houses without remembering there was anyone listening, and a young ranch hand named Diego Reyes, who worked for one of the smaller operations and who had been present 3 years ago at a meeting between his employer and Halberd's men, a meeting at which things had been said, threats had been made in language that was technically deniable but structurally unmistakable, and which Diego had described to no one since, because he hadn't understood until recently that what he'd witnessed was evidence of something. 6 people. It wasn't enough, yet not nearly enough, but it was the beginning of a shape, and Silas was patient. What he didn't know yet, what he was about to find out, was that Halberd had not been sitting still either, and that the thing Halberd had found in Silas Vane's past wasn't a warrant or a crime. It was something considerably more complicated and considerably more dangerous than either. It was a name. A name from 40 years ago, in a town 3 states east, connected to an event that Silas had spent 4 decades not thinking about, because thinking about it required him to weigh something that had no clean answer. Halberd had found the name, and he was already thinking about how to use it. The name Halberd had found was Callum. Not a last name, just Callum. The way frontier people sometimes knew each other by one name when the situation that connected them was specific enough that no last name was needed. Callum had been a sheriff in a small mining settlement called Dredge Creek 41 years ago, when Silas Vane was 19 years old and still in the process of becoming whatever he was going to become. The event connected to Callum's name was not a crime exactly. It was a shooting. A shooting in which a 19-year-old Silas had killed 2 men, both of them armed, both of them in the process of robbing the settlement's payroll, and one of them the brother of a man who had subsequently spent 11 years trying to locate Silas Vane for reasons that were not legal in nature. That man was dead now, had been dead for 20 years. The brother who'd wanted revenge had lived long enough to be consumed by it, and then died of something unrelated liver, Silas had heard, though he hadn't confirmed it, and hadn't tried to. The shooting itself had been ruled justified by 3 separate territorial courts across 2 decades of intermittent legal maneuvering by people who'd had reasons to want a different ruling. None of that was the complicated part. The complicated part was that one of the 2 men Silas had killed that night in Dredge Creek had not been robbing the payroll. He had been trying to stop the robbery. Silas hadn't known that until 6 hours after the shooting, when the dust settled and the accounting got done, and a dying man's last words were finally pieced together by people who'd been too frightened to come out of their buildings while the shooting was happening. By then, an innocent man was dead, killed by a 19-year-old's inability to distinguish, in bad light and high chaos, between a man drawing a weapon to rob and a man drawing a weapon to defend. Silas had known about it his whole adult life. He'd thought about it approximately every 3 days for 41 years. He'd told 3 people about it, total. In 4 decades, Clara was one of them, which was part of why he'd come when she wrote. Halberd didn't know the full story. What Halberd had found was the shooting record, the name Callum, the legal challenges, and the general shape of something that could be made to look considerably worse than it was, if you told it to the right people in the right way. A gunslinger, 2 dead men, a payroll, 40 years of legal complications. It was the kind of story that, stripped of context, could turn a town against a man fast. Silas found out Halberd had it on a Thursday morning, when Elena Crow came to Clara's boarding house with a look on her face that said she'd heard something she didn't want to have heard, and wasn't sure what to do with it. Elena Crow was 38, which was younger than Silas had expected when Clara first mentioned her name. She'd inherited the Crow Ranch from her husband James, who died 14 months ago from a fever that moved too fast for anyone to do much about it. She had 2 ranch hands, a small herd, and a loan that had recently developed terms she didn't recognize from the original paperwork. She was also, Silas had noticed in the few conversations they'd had, considerably sharper than people seemed to expect her to be, possibly because she didn't announce it. She sat down at Clara's kitchen table and said, "Halberd's been talking about you. At the saloon last night. Not himself, one of his men. But it came from him. What did his man say?" Elena looked at him directly. She had that quality of looking at people without managing her expression much, which Silas found useful. You generally got what she actually thought, rather than what she'd decided to present. "He said you killed 2 men in a payroll robbery 40 years ago, that you've been running from it since, that the people of Red Mesa deserve to know what kind of man is in their town." She paused. There were about 15 people in the saloon. Some of them knew your reputation already. Some of them didn't. How did it land? "Mixed," she said honestly. Walt Gruber told the man to shut his mouth, which Walt doesn't do easily. 2 of the families from the East Ridge, the Hennesseys, the Bordens, they were there, and they listened. And people who are scared don't need much to tip them toward distrust. Silas was quiet for a moment. Clara at the stove kept her back to them, but he knew she was listening. "It's not false," he said. "Not entirely. 2 men died. One of them didn't deserve to." Elena didn't flinch from that. "What happened?" he told her. The version he'd told 3 times in 41 years, not the version stripped of context that Halberd was circulating, but the actual account, with the bad light and the chaos and the 6-hour gap, before anyone understood what had really occurred, and the 19-year-old who'd made a decision in a fraction of a second that he'd been reassessing ever since. He told it without editorializing. He'd learned a long time ago that adding your own defense to a true account just made it sound like you were defending yourself, and a true account didn't need that. When he was done, Elena was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You could have told a different version of that for 40 years. Made yourself the hero of it. I know. But you didn't." "No." She looked at him for a moment longer, then nodded, once, in a way that settled something. "What does Halberd want to do with it?" "Turn the town against me before I can turn it toward itself," Silas said. "He doesn't need them to believe I'm a villain. He just needs them to hesitate, to not be sure. That's usually enough. Is it going to work?" Silas picked up his coffee cup, looked at it, set it down without drinking. "That depends on the town," he said. It was the most honest answer he had. Del Pruitt delivered a message to Silas the next morning. Not in person, Pruitt sent one of the younger men with a folded note, which was itself a kind of message. The choice of messenger communicating something about how seriously Halberd currently assessed the threat level. The note was brief. Halberd was prepared to offer Silas a financial arrangement, travel money, Enough to ride a long way from Red Mesa and stay gone. Figure was not specified in the note, but Pruitt's man, when Silas asked him directly what the number was, said $500. 500. Down from 10,000 to 500, because 10,000 was the price for Tolan to kill him, and 500 was the price to make an old man on a gray horse go away. The reduction was not insulting exactly. It was just arithmetically revealing. Silas folded the note and put it in his pocket. "Tell Mr. Halberd thank you," he said, "and tell him no." The young man looked at him for a moment, clearly trying to decide whether there was more coming, whether he was supposed to negotiate, whether he'd misheard. "That's it?" "That's it." The young man left, and Silas stood in the street in front of Clara's boarding house and looked at the town. Woman was sweeping her front step on the other side of the street. Two children were chasing something, a dog, probably around the corner of the hardware store. A wagon was parked outside the feed store, with 3 sacks of grain visible in the bed. Ordinary things. The ordinariness of a town that had been quietly strangled for 7 years and had gotten so used to the strangulation that it had started to call it ordinary. He went to find Elena. Elena Crow's ranch was a 40-minute ride south, and the land around it was good land he could see, that even in winter's approach. The grasses dried, but the soil underneath visible at fence line and creek crossing. Dark and deep. The house was functional and not comfortable. The kind of structure that told you everything you needed to know about a woman who'd spent 14 months running a cattle operation alone. The porch rail had been repaired badly and recently, using what was available rather than what was right, but it was solid. Corral gate had a new hinge that didn't quite match the old hardware. The barn door was padlocked, which was practical and sad. She was in the barn when he arrived, doing something with a length of rope that had frayed and needed splicing. She worked quickly, and without looking up when he came in, then glanced at him and went back to the rope. You could have sent a message. Could have. He looked around the barn. 3 horses, a milk, supplies stacked along the west wall, a workbench with tools that were well maintained but showing age. I wanted to see the place. And good land, he said. Your husband chose well. Something moved in her face at that, a small movement, quickly controlled, the kind you only caught if you were watching carefully for it. Kept working the rope. He did, she said after a moment. James knew land. That was his gift. He could look at a piece of ground and tell you what it wanted to be. Silas was quiet for a moment, letting that sit. Can I see the loan documents? She put down the rope. I've been through them 50 times. I know, but I haven't. She brought them from the house, a folder of papers, some originals, some clearly copies, with sections underlined in pencil, where she'd marked things that didn't match her memory of what she'd agreed to. He spread them on the workbench and went through them slowly, the way he'd learned to go through documents, not reading the main text first, but looking at the edges of things, the margins, the spacing, places where the type was slightly different from the surrounding text, places where the paper had a different quality of crease, suggesting it had been folded and unfolded at a different time from the rest of the document. The alteration wasn't crude. Whoever had done it, and it hadn't been Nathan Cole, he was increasingly certain of that, had been careful. The penalty clause that had been inserted into Section 4 of the loan agreement was typed in a font that matched of the document almost exactly. Almost. The spacing between lines was fractionally different, and the clause itself referenced a Section 11, subparagraph C, that did not exist in the document as filed. It was a self-referential error, the kind you made when you were working from a template that didn't quite match the document you were altering. You see, Elena said. She was watching him. Section 4 refers to Section 11C. Doesn't exist. Which doesn't exist, he confirmed. In a legitimate document, that would have been caught before signing. It wasn't caught because it wasn't in the document when you signed it. She sat down on a hay bale and looked at the papers spread across the workbench with the expression of someone who has been right about something for a long time and finds no satisfaction in being confirmed right. I knew it, she said quietly, not triumphantly. Just knew it. The way you know when something is wrong before you can articulate exactly why. I've known for 8 months, but knowing and being able to prove it are different things, Silas said. Yes. He began organizing the papers back into their order. Nathan Cole has original bank copies. He has the version that existed before the alteration. If the 2 versions are placed side by side in front of a territorial court, the case is not complicated. Getting them in front of a territorial court is the complicated part. She looked at him. Why are you doing this? You rode in, you opened a gate, and now you're in the middle of something that could get you killed. You don't own land here. You don't have family here. You don't owe this town anything." It was a genuine question, not a hostile one. He thought about how to answer it honestly, because she deserved an honest answer. "When I was young," he said slowly, "I made a mistake that I couldn't take back. Not criminal, I've told you about Dredge Creek, but a mistake I've carried. And I've spent 40 years watching people make the choice between the right thing and the safe thing. And I've made that choice be myself more times than I'd like to count." He closed the folder. "I'm 62 years old. At some point, the arithmetic changes. At some point, the cost of doing the right thing is less significant than it was. Because you have less left to lose. Because what I have left to lose matters less than what I could do with it," he said. "Those aren't the same thing." She was quiet for a moment, looking at him with that direct, unmanaged gaze. "James would have liked you," she said finally. "I'd have liked to meet him." She picked up the frayed rope again. "What do we do next?" What they did next was go to Walt Gruber, because Walt had been on that road the morning Silas opened the gate, and Walt had seen it, and Walt had 3 years of discrepancy in his loan records that he'd been keeping in a tin box under his floorboards because he hadn't known what else to do with them. Walt was not a complicated man. He was the kind of rancher who worked physically hard and thought carefully and made decisions slowly and kept his word, and he'd spent 3 years being angry and frightened in roughly equal measure. He was in his kitchen when they arrived, eating supper, and he looked up at the two of them in his doorway, and then looked back at his plate and said, "I've been wondering when this was coming." He pushed out the chair across from him with his foot. "Sit, there's stew." Stew was decent, and they ate some of it while Walt got the tin box from under the floor and spread its contents across the table, with the practiced care of a man who has handled those papers many times and knows exactly what's in each one. His discrepancy was different from Elena's not an altered clause, but a missing notation. Payment he'd made in the spring of the second year, in cash, to a bank representative who'd come to the ranch, for which he'd received a handwritten receipt. A payment that had subsequently not appeared in his official loan ledger. Payment whose absence was currently being used to calculate him as delinquent, and whose delinquency was being used to accelerate a penalty structure that put him 6 months from losing the broken G. "I have the receipt," Walt said. He held it up. It was wrinkled and soft from handling, the ink a little faded but entirely legible. Signed by a man named Dodd. He worked at the banks for about a year and then he was gone. "I don't know where." Silas looked at the receipt. "Nathan Cole would know where Dodd went," he said. "And Nathan Cole would know whose idea it was to send Dodd out to collect cash payments in person, rather than logging them through the normal mechanism." Walt looked at him. "You trust Cole?" "Not entirely," Silas said. "But I think he's reached his limit, or close to it." He set the receipt down carefully. "A man who has been carrying something that weighs this much for this long, sometimes all he needs, is confirmation that someone else is willing to carry part of it. And if he's not, then we find another way," Silas said. "But I think he is." Walt looked at Elena, the checking-in look of a man who needs to see whether someone he trusts also trusts the person in question. Elena gave a small nod. Walt turned back to Silas. "All right," he said. "What do you need from me?" They met with Nathan Cole 2 days later, not at the saddle shop this time, but at Elena's ranch, which was the most defensible location of the options available, not from armed attack, necessarily, but from observation. Del Pruitt's men had been visible in town more consistently over the past week, and Silas had noticed a shift in their positioning that told him Halberd was now actively surveilling rather than passively threatening. The change in posture mattered. Active surveillance meant Halberd had moved from the warning phase to the information gathering phase, which meant he was building toward something specific. Nathan arrived looking like a man who had made a decision before he left his house, and was holding it tightly in both hands so it couldn't get away from him on the ride over. He was carrying a satchel that he set on Elena's kitchen table, with a carefulness that was its own communication. "I've been keeping records," he said, without preamble, which was itself a shift from the careful, hedged man Silas had spoken with at the saddle shop, "for 4 years. Every transaction I've been directed to execute that I knew was irregular. Copies of the original loan documents before alteration, with notations of the specific changes and the approximate dates they were made. Dodd's employment record and the accounts he managed." He opened the satchel and stacked 3 bound sets of papers on the table, and the correspondence. Halberd's man, not Pruitt, another one. a lawyer in the territorial capital named Reese. They communicated through a private mailbox. I have copies of 11 letters. The room was quiet enough that the wind outside was clearly audible. Nathan, Elena said carefully. If Halberd finds us out, you have those. He's going to find out regardless, Nathan said. He said it with the steadiness of a man who had already had the frightened conversation with himself and come out the other side of it. I've understood that for 2 years. I've just been trying to find a moment when the doing of it would actually accomplish something, versus a moment when I'd be destroyed for it and nothing would change. He looked at Silas. Are you telling me this is that moment? I'm telling you it could be, Silas said, which was the most accurate thing he could say. I won't tell you it's safe. I won't tell you your son's loan is protected. I won't tell you Halberd won't come at you hard. He will. But what's in that satchel, combined with Walt's receipt and Elena's loan documents, is not just evidence of individual fraud. It's a pattern. And a pattern, properly documented and delivered to the right territorial authority, is a different kind of problem than a single contested loan. Nathan sat with that for a moment. Then, what authority? The sheriff here is compromised, Caleb Ward said from the doorway. Nobody had heard him arrive. He'd ridden in quietly and come to the door and knocked. And in the conversation, none of them had quite registered the knock. He stood in the doorway with his hat in his hand, the same young deputy who'd brushed his horse in the livery while telling Silas things he hadn't planned to say, looking like a man who had made the same kind of decision Nathan had made and arrived here by the same process. Sorry I'm late, he said, and sorry for eavesdropping on the last part. I didn't want to interrupt. He came in and sat down. The sheriff isn't going to help. But there's a territorial marshal named Garvey who's been running a circuit through the eastern counties. He's not Halberd's. I know this because Pruitt came to Beaumont 6 months ago and asked about Garvey, and Beaumont said he didn't know him well enough to know if he could be managed. And Pruitt said he'd look into it, but I don't think he ever did. He paused. Garvey's due through Callaway Station that's 30 miles east in about 12 days. Silas looked at him. You've been thinking about this. I've been thinking about it since the day you opened that gate, Caleb said. I just didn't know if there was enough yet to make it worth thinking about. Is there enough now? Elena asked. Caleb looked at the papers on the table, at Walt's tin box, which Walt had brought and set quietly in the corner, at Nathan's satchel, at the receipt in its soft, worn state, which Walt had placed on top of the stack with the particular care of someone placing a delicate thing they've been protecting for a long time. If someone can get all of this to Garvey before Halberd finds out what we're doing, Caleb said slowly, and if Garvey is what I think he is, yeah, there's enough. Someone, Walt said. Who's the someone? Not Caleb, Silas said immediately. If Caleb goes, Beaumont reports it to Halberd by sunset. Not Elena, because Halberd's already watching her ranch. Not Nathan, for the same reason. He looked at the papers. It needs to be someone Halberd doesn't have a file on. Someone who can move between here and Callaway Station in a way that doesn't read as significant. The table was quiet for a moment. My daughter, Clara says. Everyone looked at the door. Clara was standing there with a coat on and mud on her boots from the ride over, looking entirely unsurprised by the conversation she'd walked in on, because Clara was never entirely unsurprised by anything. Petra, she clarified. She makes that ride twice a month for supplies. Halberd's men don't watch her because she's nobody to them. She's just the boarding house woman's daughter doing errands. She came in and sat down without being invited. She's also not fragile. I want that understood before anyone objects. I wasn't going to object, Silas said. Good. She needs to be able to find Garvey without asking openly, Silas said. And she needs to carry the documents in a way that isn't visible. She's been hiding things in that supply wagon since she was 14, Clara said flatly. I don't know how or where, and I've never asked. She'll figure it out. Walt almost smiled at that. Almost when? 3 days, Silas said. Nathan needs 2 days to get everything organized in a form that a territorial marshal can read clearly on first pass. We don't know how much time Garvey will have to spend with it. He looked at Nathan. 2 days. 2 days, Nathan confirmed, already reaching for the satchel. Halberd found out something was happening before the 2 days were up. Not the specifics, not Garvey. Not the documents, not the meeting at Elena's ranch. But Pruitt was good at reading the town's temperature, and the town's temperature had shifted. People who'd been avoiding eye contact with each other were now having short, private conversations in inconvenient locations. Nathan Cole had left the bank 3 times in 2 days for no logged reason. Caleb Ward had ridden out the south road and come back from a direction that didn't match going south. Halberd called Pruitt in on the second evening and said, "Something's moving. I can't pin down what. It doesn't matter what. What matters is that Vane is organizing something and he's had time to do it." Halberd stood at the window, always the window. Calloway approach. Pruitt understood what he meant. The road to Calloway's station was the only logical route to outside authority. "You want it watched. I want it covered. 2 men at the junction, 2 men halfway. Anyone coming out of Red Mesa on that road in the next 10 days gets turned back." He paused, politely. "And Vane himself?" Halberd thought about it. Problem with Vane, the ongoing, persistent problem, was that the man had not made a move that was legally actionable. He'd opened a gate on a public road. He'd had private conversations with private citizens. He'd ridden around the county and looked at things. None of it was something you could arrest a man for, and arresting a man like Silas Vane without legitimate cause was the kind of thing that created attention rather than solving problems. Halberd had built his operation on not creating attention. "Leave Vane for now," he said. "Focus on the road." He didn't know about Petra. Nobody told him about Petra because nobody knew about Petra except the 6 people in Elena's kitchen, and none of them were the kind of people who talked without reason. Petra Dunn was 24, efficient, and possessed of a particular quality that made people consistently underestimate her. She was quiet in a way that read as unimportant. She wasn't meek, she had her mother's iron in her somewhere, but she'd learned young that being invisible was often more useful than being seen, and she'd developed a fluency in ordinary behavior that served her now the way a different skill might serve someone else. She left Red Mesa 2 mornings later with the supply wagon, at the time she always left, with the same route markers she always used. The documents were wrapped in oilskin and nested inside a grain sack in the wagon bed, beneath 2 actual sacks of grain and a crate of hardware supplies. The grain sack was the second from the left, which would have meant nothing to anyone opening the wagon, which no one did, because no one stopped Petra Dunny. She reached the Calloway Junction and turned east. She found Garvey at the station master's office in Calloway, which is where circuit marshals often stopped when they were moving through, and which is where Caleb had guessed he'd be. He was a compact, weathered man of 50-something who looked at her with the careful attention of a man who'd learned to distinguish between people who came to him for help and people who came to waste his time. "Marshal Garvey," she said, "my name is Petra Dunn. I'm from Red Mesa, and I have documents I need you to look at." He looked at her for a moment. Then he stepped back from the doorway. "Come in," he said. She was inside for 3 hours. When she came out, she didn't have the documents anymore. She drove back to Red Mesa at the same pace she'd gone, stopped at 2 supply merchants to purchase what the wagon manifested contained, and returned home in the early evening in time to help her mother with supper. No one had stopped her. No one had watched her. Halberd's 2 men at the junction had looked at her wagon without getting off their horses, seen a young woman with a supply load, and looked back at the road. She didn't tell anyone that night what Garvey had said, because the one thing Garvey had said beyond the 3 hours of careful examination of documents was that she should tell no one specific, not even the people who'd sent her, not the details of the conversation, not until he arrived. He'd said, "Go home, be ordinary. Don't change anything you normally do." He'd said it in the tone of a man who understood operational security and was not asking her to trust him. Without reason, he was asking her to trust a process. She went home. She was ordinary. She helped with supper and washed the dishes and went to bed at her regular time. The documents were in Garvey's hands. 12 days, he'd said. Maybe fewer. Back in Red Mesa, Silas was managing the waiting, which was its own kind of work. Halberd's men were more visible than ever, moving through town in a pattern that was designed to remind people of presence, of weight, of the particular gravity of a man who owned 3,000 acres and the bank and the road access and the sassacence of the sheriff. Silas moved through town in the opposite direction, not avoiding Halberd's men but not engaging them either, being visibly present in the same way he'd been visible from the first day at Clara's boarding house, at the livery at the general store on the street. Elena came to town twice that week, which was once more than usual, and both times she sat with Silas at the boarding house, and they talked about practical things: her cattle, the coming winter, the fence line on her north boundary that needed repair before the cold set in. They talked about these things because they were real things, and because talking about real things was, in its own way, a form of resistance against a man who wanted everyone to spend all their time thinking about him. On the 4th day of waiting, Halberd made his next move. It came through Beaumont, the sheriff arriving at the boarding house in the morning, looking uncomfortable in the particular way of a man who has been sent to do something distasteful and has made his peace with the distaste by telling himself he has no choice. He handed Silas a paper. It was a civil order, filed through the county court, Halberd's lawyer, Silas noted. Not Reese in the capital, but a local man named Ferris, who Silas hadn't dealt with, yet requiring him to appear before the county magistrate to answer questions about his history in connection with the Dredge Creek incident of 41 years ago. It wasn't a criminal summons, it was a civil order. The distinction mattered enormously. Because a civil order of this type was largely theatrical, it had no enforcement power. It couldn't compel testimony, and it could be challenged on jurisdictional grounds without significant difficulty. But it was designed to do one thing very effectively. It was designed to put Silas's past on public record in Red Mesa's, in a way that looked official. Silas read the paper twice. Beaumont stood in the doorway looking at the floor. "Did you file this?" Silas asked. "The court filed it," Beaumont said. "Who brought it to the court?" Beaumont was quiet. "Right," Silas said. He folded the paper. "Tell Ferris I'll appear as required." He paused. "And Beaumont." The sheriff looked up. Silas's voice didn't change in volume or temperature, but something since it shifted slightly, the way a conversation shifts when someone puts a different kind of weight behind what they're saying. "You're a lawman. You chose this. I know why you chose it. I've been told about the mortgage, and I'm not here to judge the pressures that put you where you are. But I want you to think about something." He let a moment pass. "People in this town who are being squeezed, they chose to trust a system that was supposed to protect them. You're part of that system. Not Halberd, you." He handed the folded paper back. "Keep this. I don't need it." Beaumont stood in the doorway for a moment, with the paper in his hand, and on his face was something complicated, not shame exactly, not anger, something that didn't have a clean name, but lived in the territory between the two. Then he left. Clara appeared in the kitchen doorway. "That wasn't smart," she said, poking at Beaumont. "Maybe not," Silas admitted. "But I wanted him to have something to think about." He looked at the door. Some men, when you give them a thing to think about it. And some men go straight to the person who owns their mortgage and tell him what was said. "Also possible," Silas said. He picked up his coffee. "But I don't think Beaumont is that far gone. Not entirely." He paused. "Not yet. He was right, and he was wrong about that. And he wouldn't know for certain which until events moved faster than anyone in that kitchen was currently prepared for them to move. On the 6th day of waiting, Walt Gruber's cattle were moved. Not stolen, moved. 3 of Halberd's men rode onto the Broken G in the early morning, before Walt was out, and pushed 60 head of cattle off the east pasture through a fence line and onto Halberd's adjacent land. And when Walt came out and found them, and rode to where they'd ended up and confronted Pruitt, who was there waiting, which told Walt the whole thing had been orchestrated in advance. Pruitt said that the cattle had wandered onto Rafter H land through a broken fence, and that per the grazing rights agreement Walt had signed 2 years ago, improperly penned animals that crossed onto Rafter H land could be held pending payment of a grazing fee. Walt had signed no such agreement. He told Pruitt this. Pruitt showed him a document. Walt looked at the document and recognized his signature, and did not recognize the grazing rights clause that his signature was attached to. He rode to Elena Road to town. Silas was on the street when they arrived, and he could read from the quality of Elena's movement on horseback the way she was riding, which was faster than she normally rode, and straighter, that something had happened. She told him in 20 words. He thought about it for maybe 5 seconds. "He's accelerating," Silas said. "He doesn't know about Garvey specifically, but he knows something's moving, and he's trying to create enough simultaneous pressure that people break before whatever's moving arrives." He looked at Walt. "Cattle are safe?" "For now." Pruitt said he'd hold them until the grazing fee was paid. "The fee, don't pay it," Silas said. "Whatever you do, don't pay it. Paying it acknowledges the clause. The moment you acknowledge the clause, you validated a document that you didn't sign in that form." He looked at Elena. "Same with your penalty clause. Don't make any payment that could be construed as accepting the modified terms. If Walt doesn't pay, Pruitt will—" "I know what Pruitt will do," Silas said. He was already thinking ahead, thinking about 6 days, and Garvey and the pace at which a territorial marshal could move when he understood the urgency. Let him do it. Let Halberd move everything forward he wants to move forward. Every action he takes is documentation of a pattern. He paused. "I need to send a message to Caleb." Elena looked at him. "What kind of message?" "I need Caleb to get a letter to Callaway Station without using the road." He looked at the buildings around them, at the town going about its morning business in the way it did every morning, with the underlying tension of a place that had been living with something wrong for too long. There's a creek path, south of the East Junction. Longer. But Halberd's men are watching the road, not the creek. Caleb knows that path, Elena said quietly. He used to fish it when he was young. Good. Silas pulled a small notebook from his coat pocket and wrote 4 lines in it. He tore out the page, folded it, and gave it to Elena. Get this to Caleb without going through the center of town. Don't tell Beaumont, don't let anyone in Halberd's circle see you hand it off. Took it, looked at it without unfolding it, and nodded. She and Walt rode off at different angles. Silas stood in the street alone for a moment. The note said Garvey needs to move. Tell him 7 days is too long. Tell him what happened to the cattle. Tell him Halberd is escalating, and the documentation window may close. I don't know if you can reach him by the creek path. Try. He went back to Clara's. He drank bad coffee. He waited, because waiting was what the moment required, and because a man who had spent 40 years learning the difference between patience and passivity knew the difference precisely. 3 days later, he would wish he'd had a week. But they didn't have a week. They had 3 days, and what arrived at the end of those 3 days was not what any of them had planned for, and it changed everything. Caleb didn't make it to the creek path. He got as far as the livery, where he'd gone to saddle his horse under the pretense of an evening patrol, and Del Pruitt was waiting there. Not aggressively. Pruitt didn't do things aggressively when he could do them quietly, just standing near the stall door with his thumbs in his belt and the particular stillness of a man who has positioned himself somewhere for a reason. Evening, Deputy Pruitt said. Caleb kept moving toward his horse. Evening. You riding out patrol? Pruitt looked at the window. Outside, it was getting dark. Beaumont usually runs evening patrol himself on Thursdays. Caleb said nothing, because there was nothing to say to that. He was right, and they both knew it. He saddled his horse anyway, because stopping would have been its own communication, and rode out the north end of town, which was not toward the creek path, and did a circuit that was genuinely a patrol and accomplished nothing except burning an hour and a half of the remaining daylight. When he came back, Pruitt was gone. But the message had been received in both directions. Caleb knew he was being watched specifically now, not as a general feature of Halberd's town surveillance, but as an individual of concern. And Pruitt knew that Caleb had known he was there and had changed his route because of it. He found Silas at Clara's after dark and told him what had happened. Silas listened without interruption, then sat for a moment with the dead fireplace in front of him, the evening cold coming through the window seams. He's watching you, Silas said. He's watching everyone. But yeah, me specifically now. Caleb pulled off his hat and ran a hand through his hair, which was a gesture Silas had noticed he made when he was working through something that frustrated him. I should have been more careful. You were careful, Silas said. Pruitt is just better at this than most people give him credit for. He looked at the window. The note didn't go. We need another way. There isn't one that doesn't take twice as long, Caleb said. If someone goes around the South Ridge instead of the creek path, it adds 4 hours minimum. Garvey might not wait. Garvey will wait if he's what you think he is, Silas said. A territorial marshal sitting on a package of fraud documentation is not going to ride away from it in a hurry. He paused. But Halberd moving on Walt's cattle tells me we have less time than I thought. He looked at Caleb. Who does Halberd not watch? Who moves through this county that he hasn't thought to put a man on? Caleb thought about it. Clara, in the doorway of the kitchen, thought about it with him. The fire that wasn't lit, the cold coming in. 3 people in a dark room trying to find a gap in a net that had been built carefully over 7 years. Hensey's boy, Clara said. Tommy, he's 12. Rides to Callaway for his mother every few weeks. Too young, Caleb said. I've seen that boy handle a horse, Clara said. He's not too young, he's just young. She looked at Silas. And nobody is watching a 12-year-old boy on an errand for his mother. Silas thought about what it meant to put a 12-year-old in the path of something this serious. He thought about for a full minute, which was longer than he usually thought about anything. Then he thought about Walt Gruber's cattle on the wrong side of a fence, Elena's forged loan clause, Nathan's 3 years of hidden records, 6 ranches losing road access to market, a town that had been breathing carefully for 7 years because a man with 3,000 acres had decided that everything around him was his. Does Tommy know the Callaway Road? He asked. Better than his mother does, Clara said. Can you talk to Mrs. Hennessy tonight? I can talk to her tonight. The note needs to be small enough to fit inside a boot. Silas said. And Tommy needs to understand that he hands it only to Garvey and to no one else, and that if anyone stops him on the road, it's a letter for his aunt in Callaway. Is there an aunt? A cousin, Clara said. Close enough. Tommy Hensey's rode to Callaway the next morning, as he'd ridden before unhurried, unremarkable, a boy on a horse with a saddlebag of legitimate items his mother needed from the supply merchant. 2 of Halberd's men were at the East Junction. They watched him ride past. One of them said something to the other. They both looked at the road behind him for the more significant traffic they were waiting for, and Tommy Hennessy kept riding. 3 days that followed were the longest Silas had spent in a single place in years, and they had the particular quality of time that moves strangely when you're waiting for something that may or may not arrive before something else does. He kept his routine's coffee at Clara's, the slow circuit of town on foot, the conversations with Elena and Walt and Nathan that were conducted carefully, in fragments, never all together, never in ways that looked like meeting. He watched Halberd's men and noted when their patterns shifted. He watched Beaumont, who had retreated into the particular invisibility of a man who is pretending he is not involved in something he is very much involved in. On the second of those 3 days, Elena's north fence was cut. Not all of it a section, cleanly, with wire cutters, the kind of work that left no accident about what it was. 2 of her cattle got through before she found it in the morning. Cattle didn't go far, but the fence took half a day to repair, and while she was repairing it, one of Halberd's men rode by on the adjacent road 3 times, not stopping, just riding past. And each time he rode past, he looked at her in a way that was designed to communicate something without saying anything. She looked back at him each time. She didn't stop working. She told Silas that evening. He listened and said, "How are your hands?" She looked at her hands. They were cut up from the wire. "Fine," she said. "Can you shoot?" The question landed differently than she'd expected. She took a moment before answering. "James taught me." "I'm not," she stopped. "I'm accurate enough at close range." "I've never had to." "I know," Silas said. "I'm not asking because I think you'll need to. I'm asking because knowing you can changes how you carry yourself, and how you carry yourself changes how people read you." He paused. "Halberd is trying to make you feel alone and exposed. The best answer to that isn't a show of force. It's just not looking alone." "I'm not alone," she said. She said it like she was also reminding herself of it. "No," Silas said. "You're not." On the morning of the 3rd day, 3 things happened in an order that mattered. First, Nathan Cole arrived at Clara's boarding house before the bank opened, which was unusual enough that Clara registered it immediately. He came in quickly, took the chair at the kitchen table that he'd sat in before, and said without prelude, "Halberd's lawyer Ferris was at the bank yesterday evening, after hours, with Pruitt." He stopped to breathe. They went into the records room. "I wasn't there," I found out this morning from the night custodian, who didn't understand what he was seeing, but described it clearly enough. He looked at Silas. They were looking for the original loan documents, the unaltered versions. Silas went still. "Do they know you have copies?" "I don't know. Maybe not. But if they went looking for the originals, they know the originals exist in a form different from what they filed," Silas said. "Whether they know you have copies is a separate question." He thought for a moment. "Where are the originals?" "In the records room, filed under the standard loan numbers. I couldn't move them without creating a gap in the records that would be more conspicuous than leaving them." Nathan's hands on the table were not steady. He was managing it, but not entirely. If Ferris got to them last night, would he have known what he was looking for, specifically? Nathan thought about it. The records are organized by loan number, not by borrower name. Ferris would need to know the specific loan numbers to find the right files, and those numbers aren't publicly accessible. He paused. But Halberd would have his own copies of the loan numbers from when he directed the alterations. Second thing, Caleb came in through the back door, which told Silas that he'd been careful about being seen approaching. He was breathing a little fast from walking quickly. "Garvey's on the road," he said. "Tommy came back an hour ago. Garvey left Callaway yesterday. He's riding with 2 deputies. The room changed when he said that. Not visibly, nobody moved or made a sound, but the quality of the silence shifted, became something with more weight and more direction to it. "How far out?" Silas asked. Tommy said Garvey told him to say by noon tomorrow if the road is clear. "The road won't be clear," Silas said immediately. "Halberd has men at the junction. Garvey will hit them within 4 miles of town." He looked at Caleb. "Does Garvey know about the junction watch?" The note said Halberd was watching the road. Garvey's a marshal. He'll know what that means. Third thing, Walt Gruber came through the front door, and his face had a look on it that Silas had seen on men before, the look of someone who has just found the last door closed and is recalculating in real time. Pruitt rode out to the Broken G this morning, Walt said. Gave me until sunset today to pay the grazing fee. $460. He said the number the way you say, a number that represents everything you currently have. If I don't pay by sunset, he says they're moving the cattle to Halberd's South paddocks and filing them as abandoned property. $460. Abandoned property. A legal mechanism irregular, challengeable, but functional in a county where the magistrate had been filed as a courtesy location for Halberd's paperwork for the better part of a decade. He's pushing everything to close before Garvey gets here, Elena said. She'd come in behind Walt, which meant she'd been outside for part of this and had put it together on her ride-in. She was right, and everyone in the room knew she was right. Halberd had either heard something about Garvey, possibly through Beaumont, possibly through his own observations of the town's shifting temperature, or he'd simply decided that the pace of whatever was moving against him required acceleration. Either way, the effect was the same. He was collapsing the timeline. Silas looked around the room. Clara, Nathan, Caleb, Elena, Walt. 5 people, 4 of whom had spent years navigating carefully around a man with 3,000 acres, and a purchased bank and a sheriff with a mortgage. 5 people who had been patient and strategic and correct in their assessment of what needed to happen, and who were now 24 hours from the arrival of someone with the authority to make it matter, and who had a sunset deadline on Walt's cattle and Ferris in the records room, and Halberd's men on the junction road to get through first. Walt, Silas said, don't pay. If I don't pay by sunset, I lose 60 head. You might lose them anyway, once Ferris finds the lone originals and starts moving the legal levers. Cattle aren't the thing to protect right now. Silas looked at him directly. I know that's easy for me to say. I know those cattle are your livelihood. I'm not dismissing that, he paused. But if you pay, you validate the clause, and the clause is the tool Halberd uses to take the ranch itself. 60 cattle is a loss. The Broken G is a different kind of loss. Walt was quiet for a long moment. The kind of quiet that a man earns by having worked a piece of land for enough years that losing it isn't an abstract financial concept, but something more like losing a part of his own chronology. Then he said, all right, and that was all he said. Nathan, Silas said, the original loan documents in the records room, is there any legitimate reason you could access them today that wouldn't be conspicuous? Nathan thought. Year-end reconciliation. I do a records review every November. It's in the bank's operational calendar. Today is November 3rd. Then do your reconciliation today. Start with the standard accounts and work your way to the loan files. Document everything you review, routine notation. Nothing that looks selective. He paused. And when you get to the files Ferris was looking at last night, note their condition. Anything has been altered or removed, that notation is evidence of interference. And if Ferris comes in while I'm doing it, then you're doing your November reconciliation, Silas said, which is exactly what you're doing. Nathan nodded and left. Caleb, Silas said. I know, Caleb said, the junction. Garvey is a territorial marshal with 2 deputies. Halberd's men at the junction have instructions to turn back traffic politely. They won't pull weapons on a badge that's a line even. Halberd's people won't cross openly. He looked at Caleb, but Pruitt will send someone to Halberd the moment Garvey is spotted on that road, and Halberd will have time to move things, documents, people, whatever he's been keeping that needs to disappear before an official examination, if we're not ready for that. What does ready look like? It looks like you being at the bank when Garvey arrives in town, not waiting at the edge of town for him, at the bank, so that Halberd's first indication that Garvey has passed the junction is a territorial marshal walking through the front door of the bank with a deputy sheriff at his side. Caleb stared at him. Beaumont won't do anything, Silas said, because by the time Garvey arrives, I'm going to have a conversation with Beaumont. And I think I'm not certain, but I think that what I have to say to him will be enough. What are you going to say to him? The truth, Silas said, which I've found is almost always the most dangerous thing you can tell a man who's been avoiding it. He found Beaumont at the sheriff's office in the mid-morning, sitting behind his desk with the look of a man who has been waiting for something unpleasant and has started to confuse the waiting with the thing itself. The office smelled like old coffee and boot leather, and the morning light came through the east window at an angle that made the dust on the desk visible. Silas sat down across from him without being invited. Beaumont didn't object. They looked at each other for a moment. I'm going to tell you what's coming, Silas said. Not because I want something from you today, but because tomorrow, when it arrives, you're going to have to decide who you are in this county, and I'd rather you have time to think about it than have to decide in 10 seconds. Beaumont's jaw tightened slightly. You're not my... I know I'm not anything to you officially, Silas said. I'm an old man passing through your town. But I've been in enough situations like this to know that the people who end up on the wrong side of them usually get there because nobody told them clearly enough what was coming. He leaned forward slightly. Territorial Marshal Garvey is on the road. He'll be in Red Mesa tomorrow. He has documentation of systematic loan fraud, document alteration, illegal road closure, and coercive business practices that connect to Everett Halberd specifically and to transactions that went through this county's bank. He paused. Everything Nathan Cole has been keeping for 4 years. Everything Walt Gruber found in his tin box. Everything Elena Crow's loan documents show about what was in them before and after she signed. Beaumont was very still. Now Silas continued. Your name is not in those documents. Your mortgage is not a crime. Taking a loan from a bank is not a crime. What you've done is not cooperate with an investigation that you didn't have the standing or the protection to pursue on your own. That's a different thing from participating in fraud. He watched the sheriff's face. But when Garvey arrives, if you are on the wrong side of that door, if you have done something in the hours between now and then, that puts you in Halberd's camp at the moment when Halberd's camp collapses, that is a different thing entirely. Beaumont looked at his desk, at his hands, at the window. He looked like a man who had been holding a very heavy object for a very long time, and was being told that he was allowed to put it down. But that putting it down would require acknowledging how long he'd been holding it. He owns my mortgage, Beaumont said finally. Not defensively, just factually. The way you say a thing that has shaped your life for years. I know. If he calls it, then a territorial investigation into bank fraud will likely include a review of mortgage acceleration clauses applied as coercive tools, Silas said, which means your mortgage becomes a piece of evidence rather than a liability. He paused. Can't promise you that works out cleanly. I'm not going to promise you things I don't know. But I can tell you that the worst thing you can do for your own situation right now is do something for Halberd between now and noon tomorrow. The room was quiet for a while. Beaumont's coffee cup was sitting on the corner of the desk, empty. He reached for it and then seemed to realize it was empty and put it back. What do you need from me? He said finally. Nothing today, Silas said. Tomorrow when Garvey gets here, I need you to open the door. He left Beaumont in his office and walked back out into the street. The afternoon moved with that same strange pace. Silas rode out to the canyon east of town in the early afternoon because Pruitt's movements over the past 2 days had suggested a pattern that he wanted to understand before it became relevant. Canyon was the natural choke point on the road from the east, the place where a small group of men with the high ground could stop a larger group from moving forward, or at minimum make moving forward very expensive. Halberd had used the terrain before. The canyon had been the site, 3 years ago, of a confrontation between 2 ranching families that had been orchestrated by Halberd's men in ways that nobody had been able to prove definitively. Silas had heard this from Walt, who'd heard it from a man who no longer lived in the county. He rode through the canyon slowly, letting Ash pick the path, looking at the walls and the sight lines, and the places where a man on horseback could position himself, and what that positioning would allow him to see or prevent. He did this not because he planned to fight in the canyon. He genuinely did not want to fight. Preference that came not from fear but from 40 years of understanding what fighting cost, even when you survived it, but because a man who understood the terrain had options that a man who didn't understand it didn't have. On his way back, one of Halberd's men fell in behind him, not immediately behind at a distance, visible, not concealed. It was a message. You're being watched. You're being followed. You exist in a space that belongs to someone else. Silas rode at his regular pace and didn't look back, because looking back was a form of acknowledgement, and acknowledging it was a form of response, and he didn't want to give the communication the answers it was asking for. When he reached the edge of town, the man behind him peeled off toward the Rafter H Road. Message delivered. Silas unsaddled Ash at the livery, brushed him down, made sure he had water, and walked back to Clara's. Elena was there. She'd ridden in and tied her horse at the rail and come inside, and was sitting at Clara's kitchen table with a cup of something that was not coffee Clara's chicory blend. which tasted closer to coffee than anything else available, but which had its own particular bitterness. She looked up when Silas came in. "Pruitt came to the ranch this afternoon," she said. "In person, not a hand Pruitt himself." Silas hung up his coat. "What did he say?" "He said Halberd was prepared to make me an offer. Purchase offer on the ranch. He said the current market valuation, given the outstanding loan issues, was, she said, a number that was less than half what the land was worth. And she set it with a flatness that communicated very clearly what she thought of it, and that the offer would remain open until end of business tomorrow." "End of business tomorrow," Silas said. Tomorrow Garvey would arrive. Halberd's deadline matched Garvey's arrival within hours, which meant either coincidence or better information than Silas had credited him with. "He knows Garvey's coming," Silas said. Elena looked at him. "How? I don't know." "Beaumont, maybe not directly. But Beaumont's behavior has changed since my visit this morning, and Pruitt is good at reading behavior." He sat down. "Or someone in Callaway talked. Does it change things?" He thought about it honestly. "It changes the order of things," he said. "If Halberd knows Garvey is coming and is still sending Pruitt to make purchase offers, it means he either believes he can still clean up the documents in time, or he's trying to convert ranch title before a fraud investigation freezes his transactions." He looked at the table. "Either way, it means tomorrow is going to be harder than I planned." "How much harder?" "I don't know yet." He looked at her. "Don't take the offer." "I wasn't going to take the offer." "I know," he said. "I just wanted to say it out loud." She almost smiled at that. "Almost. What's your plan for harder?" "I'm working on it," he said, which was true. He was always working on it. The working was just quiet and slow and looked, from the outside, like an old man sitting still. Halberd called his men in that evening. All of them Pruitt, the 6 ranch hands who doubled as enforcers, 4 additional hired men who'd been in the area for a month doing work that Halberd described as security consulting, and 2 men who'd arrived that week from the south. 13 men total, gathered in the main room of the Rafter H in the evening lamplight while Halberd stood at the head of the room and explained the situation with the same measured, careful voice he always used. He told them that a territorial marshal was expected in Red Mesa the following day. He told them that certain parties in the county had provided that marshal with documents that he chose the word carefully contested. He told them that the legal process would take time, that contested documents were the beginning of a process and not the end of one, and that what mattered in the next 24 hours was ensuring that the context in which those documents arrived was the right context. "There are 6 people in this county who have been actively working against the interests of this operation," he said. "I want them visible tomorrow. I want them occupied. I want their attention divided." He looked at Pruitt. "The old man's horse." Pruitt nodded. "And the widow's cattle. Move them tonight. Not onto our land, onto the Hennessy Range. If she's dealing with a cattle dispute with 2 neighbors simultaneously, she's not standing at the door of the bank when a marshal arrives." Pruitt wrote something in the small notebook he carried. "And Vane himself?" Halberd thought about Silas Vane. He thought about a man who had turned down $500 to leave a town that wasn't his and had spent 3 weeks systematically connecting 6 people who'd been isolated from each other for years. He thought about the gate and the pry bar and the hardware set down against the fence post like a piece of trash. "Vane is going to be in the canyon tomorrow morning," Halberd said. He said it with the confidence of a man who had thought it through carefully and tested the logic. Canyon is where he went this afternoon. He was mapping it. He's planning to use it to slow Garvey's approach, or to create a confrontation point away from town. He looked at the room. 7 men in the canyon before dawn, not to kill him, to delay him, to keep him out of town until after I've had my conversation with the marshal. "What if he doesn't go to the canyon?" one of the newer men asked. "He'll go to the canyon," Halberd said. "He's strategic. He thinks like a man who has survived by understanding terrain. He went there this afternoon to look at it, which means he's planning something there. I'm going to let him plan it, and then I'm going to be ready for his plan." He paused. "The rest of you cover the bank entrance, the boarding house, and the land office. Visible but not threatening. We are lawful citizens of this county going about our business. Any questions?" There were no questions. Halberd went to bed at his usual hour. He slept adequately, which was something he had always been able to do, sleep adequately, regardless of what was pending, because sleep, like everything else, was a resource. And a man who wasted resources on anxiety was a man who lost. Silas did not go to the canyon. He was not asleep, and he was not at Clara's boarding house, and he was not at the livery with Ash, which was where Halberd's man spent several hours watching the dark building from across the street. Silas had left Ash at the livery because Ash was a gray horse, and gray horses were visible in the dark, and because where Silas was going didn't require a horse. He was at the bank. The bank was closed, locked, dark. He'd spent 2 hours in the late afternoon figuring out how to get in, which had involved a conversation with Nathan Cole, that Nathan would later describe as one of the more uncomfortable conversations of his life, and which had resulted in Nathan leaving a specific back window latch in a specific unlatched position before he left for the evening. Nathan had not been happy about it. He'd been, in his own words, a banker for 23 years, and bankers did not unlatch windows for people. Silas had pointed out that Nathan had also, for the past 4 years, been maintaining secret records of fraud, and Nathan had gone quiet for a moment and then unlatched the window. Silas was inside the records room by 11 in the evening. He was not there to take anything. Taking things from a bank, even fraudulent records in a corrupt bank, was the kind of action that could be used to contaminate everything else a territorial marshal arriving to find that the evidence had been removed from an institution by a private citizen was an investigative problem that Silas did not want to create. He was there to look, and what he was looking for was the thing Nathan had flagged, the condition of the loan files after Ferris's visit the previous evening. The files were there, all of them, but 2 of them had been accessed. The filing tabs were slightly off, the kind of fractional misalignment that you created when you pulled a file and replaced it in a hurry by lamplight. Couldn't tell in the dark whether the documents inside had been altered. What he could tell, and what he notated in the small notebook he carried, was the state of the file tabs and the pattern of which files had been accessed. He was back outside before midnight. He relatched the window from outside not perfectly, but close enough, and walked back to Clara's through the empty back streets of a town that was sleeping on top of something that was about to change. He sat in Clara's kitchen in the dark and drank water and thought about what he knew and what he didn't know and what Halberd would do in the morning and whether Beaumont would open the door or close it. Dawn came gray and cold. He made coffee on the low heat of the kitchen stove and watched the light change outside the window and thought about Garvey on the road, 3 hours out, riding toward a town where 13 men were positioned to make his arrival complicated. When Clara came down, she looked at him and said, "You didn't sleep." "Slept some." "How much?" "Enough," he said, which was not an answer to the question she'd asked. She poured her own coffee and sat down and didn't push it, because she knew him well enough to know that the things he left unsaid were not always the things he was keeping from her. Sometimes they were just the things he hadn't finished working out yet. "What do you need this morning?" she asked. "I need Caleb at the bank by 10 o'clock, he said. "Regardless of Beaumont." "Regardless of Pruitt. Caleb at the bank door at 10 with his badge where people can see it. I'll get word to him. I need Walt to keep his cattle dispute public. Don't resolve it quietly, don't negotiate. Let Pruitt's filing stand and let it be visible. The more Halberd's machinery is visible and operating, the more there is for Garvey to see when he arrives. And Elena? He thought about Elena, about the purchase offer and the cut fence and the cattle moved to the wrong range and the forged clause in Section 4. About a woman who had been alone on a good piece of land for 14 months, doing the work of 2 people while a powerful man calculated the precise moment to take everything James Crow had chosen. "Tell Elena to stay at her ranch until 9, he said. "Then ride into town. Ride down Main Street, don't hurry. Don't avoid Halberd's men," he paused. "Let herself be seen. A woman on her own land, in her own town, going about her own business." He looked at Clara. "That's what Halberd is trying to erase, that ordinary fact. The fact that this is her town and her land and her life." His voice was even, but something underneath it wasn't entirely even. Let her be seen being that. Clara looked at him for a moment. "You've been carrying something since Dredge Creek for 40 years, she said. He didn't answer that. "I'm not saying it like a criticism," she said. "I'm saying it because I watch you look at these people, Walt, Elena, Caleb, and I see something in your face that I don't think you see in your own face." He drank his coffee. "You came here because I wrote you a letter," Clara said. "But I think you also came because you needed somewhere that the thing you carry could do some good." She stood, picked up her cup. "Think that's allowed." He sat with that for a moment, alone in the kitchen, while the light outside shifted from gray to pale gold, and somewhere a horse moved and a door opened, and the ordinary morning of a place that was about to stop being ordinary began. At 9 o'clock he put on his coat and went out. Halberd's 7 men were in the canyon, waiting for him. He was not in the canyon. He was walking toward the center of Red Mesa, hands at his sides, moving at the pace of a man who has somewhere specific to be and is not in a hurry about it, because being in a hurry told people things you didn't necessarily want them to know. He was thinking about what came next, and what came after that, and whether Beaumont would open the door when Garvey knocked. And somewhere on the eastern road, getting closer with every hour, Territorial Marshal with 2 deputies and a satchel full of documentation was riding toward a town that didn't know yet whether it had enough courage to take back what had been taken from it. Garvey reached the East Junction at 8:30. Halberd's 2 men had been there since before dawn, which told Garvey something useful about how seriously the operation on the other end of this road took the idea of controlling who came and went. He'd seen junction watches before, in 3 other counties over a 20-year career, and they always looked the same. Men positioned to appear casual while doing something that was not casual at all. These 2 had the additional quality of not quite knowing what to do when the thing they were watching for turned out to be a territorial marshal's badge on a man who didn't slow down when he saw them. Garvey rode through the junction without stopping. His 2 deputies rode on either side of him. One of Halberd's men reached for his horse's reins as if he might give chase, then looked at the badge again and thought better of it. The other man was already riding hard for the Rafter H. Garvey noted this and kept his pace. He had 30 minutes, maybe 40, before Halberd knew he was on the final approach. He intended to use them. Silas was standing on the Main Street boardwalk when Garvey rode in, and the sight of 3 horses with badges coming down the center of the street at a purposeful walk produced an effect on the town that Silas had been hoping for and hadn't been certain of. People stopped. People who had been moving with the careful, managed quality of a town under long pressure suddenly stopped moving and stood still and watched. And the watching itself was a kind of declaration. The act of standing openly and looking at a territorial marshal riding into your town was a way of saying, without words, that you wanted him there. Halberd's 4 men near the bank entrance watched too. They didn't move away, but they didn't move toward anything either. And in that moment of stillness, before anyone had made any further decision, Caleb Ward came out of the bank doorway where he'd been positioned since 9 o'clock and walked to the edge of the boardwalk and raised one hand in a gesture that Garvey read correctly as, "Here." Garvey pulled up. He looked at Caleb. He looked at the badge. He looked at the 4 men near the bank entrance who were trying to look like they weren't watching him. He looked at Silas on the boardwalk across the street, and something passed between them, not recognition exactly, since they'd never met, but the particular acknowledgement of 2 men who have been working toward the same point from different directions. "Caleb Ward," Caleb said, "Deputy. I'm the one who sent the note." "Garvey." He dismounted. His 2 deputies stayed mounted, positioned with the unconscious efficiency of men who understood how to cover a location. "Where's the bank's officer inside?" "Nathan Cole. He's been waiting." Garvey turned and looked at the 4 men near the entrance. He looked at them the way a man looks at something he's already categorized and decided about. "You men work for Halberd?" he asked, conversationally. None of them answered. "I'll take that as a yes," Garvey said. "You're welcome to stay where you are. If anyone approaches this building in a way that interferes with a territorial investigation, that's a criminal matter. We clear?" One of them looked at the others. None of them moved. Garvey went inside. Silas crossed the street and fell in behind Garvey's deputies not inside, not officially part of what was happening in that bank, because he had no official standing and had never pretended to. He stood outside on the boardwalk, which is where he'd been standing for 3 weeks in various forms, and he watched the town. Elena rode in at 9:15, exactly as Clara had relayed, came down Main Street at a walk, on her own horse, wearing the same coat she always wore, and she looked straight ahead the way a woman looks when she's decided not to accommodate anyone else's discomfort about her presence. 2 of Halberd's men near the saloon watched her ride past. She didn't look at them. She tied her horse at the rail near Clara's boarding house and walked to where Silas was standing. "Garvey's inside," she said. "Has been for 10 minutes. She looked at the bank door. "Nathan?" "Inside with him." She nodded. They stood together on the boardwalk in the cold morning air and watched the town recalibrate around the fact of a territorial marshal in the bank, which was itself a kind of event. The way a stone dropped in still water was an event, not because of the stone itself, but because of what moved outward from it. Walt Gruber arrived at 9:30, riding in from the south with the deliberate pace of a man who had decided that his cattle were going to be impounded, regardless of what he did, and had elected to be present for whatever came next. He tied up beside Elena's horse and came to stand on the other side of Silas without saying anything, which was a Walt Gruber thing to do. He communicated in presence, more than in words. The town was gathering itself. Not dramatically, nobody was shouting, nobody was running. Nobody was doing anything that could be characterized as assembly or demonstration. People were simply finding reasons to be on Main Street on a Tuesday morning and remaining there, the way people do in a small town when they can feel something important happening and don't want to be the person who stayed home. Halberd's man reached the Rafter H at 9:45. Halberd was at his desk when Pruitt came in, and his face, when Pruitt told him what had happened at the junction, did not change. This was notable to Pruitt, who had worked for the man for 9 years and had learned to read the absence of expression as a more significant indicator than most men's visible reactions. Halberd not changing his expression when he received bad news meant he was processing it at a level below where expressions were generated. "How long has he been in the bank?" Halberd asked. 20 minutes, maybe. Hensley said he went straight in. Cole was waiting and Vane on the boardwalk, outside. Halberd was quiet for a moment. He looked at his desk. He looked at the window. The 7 men in the canyon had been sitting there for 4 hours waiting for an old man on a gray horse who had never showed up, which meant either that Vane had changed his plan or that Halberd had misread the plan to begin with, and both possibilities were uncomfortable in different ways. "Call the men back from the canyon," he said. "All of them?" "All of them. And tell Ferris to meet me at the bank." He stood. "If Garvey has the documents Cole has been keeping, the document question is finished. We move to the next question, which is whether a territorial marshal's investigation can be contested on procedural grounds in a way that buys enough time to transfer title on 3 properties. He picked up his coat. Cole's records are internal bank records. There's an argument that a territorial marshal requires a county court order to compel their production. Ferris knows that argument. Pruitt looked at him carefully. And if the county magistrate won't issue the order on that timeline, Beaumont, Halberd said. Beaumont can file an injunction as the county's law enforcement representative. It's thin, but thin buys time, and time is what I need right now. He buttoned his coat. How many men do we have in town? 4 at the bank entrance. 3 near the boarding house. 2 at the land office. 9 men visible in town when a territorial marshal is conducting an investigation is too visible, Halberd said. Pull them back to the edge. Keep 2 on the main road and 2 near the bank. The rest out of sight. He paused. We're not threatening a federal officer. We're going about our business. He rode toward town. Nathan Cole had been talking for 40 minutes when Halberd arrived. He'd laid out the documentation in the order Silas had suggested, not chronologically, which was the natural order, but also the order most easily challenged piece by piece, but structurally, organized around the pattern. The altered loan documents first, with the original versions beside them, the typographic discrepancies annotated in Nathan's precise handwriting. Then the payment records, including the gap where Walt's cash payment had vanished, and Dodd's employment record, and the account he'd managed, and the timeline that showed Dodd's departure from the bank, happening 3 weeks after the gap in Walt's ledger. Then Ferris's letters, 11 of them, careful and legally hedged in their language, but unmistakable in aggregate about what they were directing. Garvey read slowly and didn't ask many questions while he was reading, which Nathan had been warned to expect. Caleb stood near the door and watched both the marshal and the room and the street outside through the window. When Halberd walked through the bank's front door, Caleb saw him before anyone else did and said quietly, "Garvey." Garvey looked up from the documents. He looked at Halberd, and Halberd looked at him, and for a moment the room had the quality of 2 forces that have been approaching each other from a distance, finally arriving at the same point and stopping to assess. "Mr. Halberd," Garvey said. Not unfriendly, not anything particularly. Just naming him. "Marshal." Halberd's voice was exactly what it always was. "I heard there was a territorial officer in town. I wanted to introduce myself and offer any assistance the county can provide." He looked at the documents on the table with the careful non-reaction of a man who has practiced not reacting. "I understand there are some contested matters relating to bank records." "Contested is one word," Garvey said. "I've been advised that the production of internal bank records to a territorial officer without a county court order may not be procedurally." Mr. Halberd, Garvey's voice didn't change. I've been doing this for 20 years. I've heard the procedural argument in 4 counties. It's a good argument and it sometimes works, and it's going to take about 6 weeks to resolve in the territorial court, during which time I will have filed a preliminary injunction that freezes all property transactions in this county that involve your operation. He paused. So you're welcome to pursue it. That's your right. But I want you to understand clearly what pursuing it costs you versus what sitting down and having a direct conversation with me costs you, so that you make an informed choice. The room was very quiet. Halberd looked at Nathan Cole, who was looking at the table. He looked at Caleb Ward, who was looking at him steadily. He looked at the documents spread across the table in their organized, annotated form. And in that look, Silas, watching through the window from the boardwalk, could see the moment when Halberd understood that the thing he was looking at was not the work of frightened people throwing documents at a marshal and hoping something stuck. It was a case, built carefully over weeks, by people who understood that documentation was the only tool that actually worked against a man who operated through documentation. Who built this? Halberd asked. He directed the question at no one in particular, but the direction of his eyes when he said it went briefly toward the window, toward the boardwalk, toward the old man in the coat standing outside. Several people, Garvey said. That's generally how these things work. Silas knew, from where he was standing, that he was not going to be invited inside that bank. His role in what happened in that room was already complete, had been complete the moment Garvey sat down at that table with Nathan's documentation. What happened next was between a territorial marshal and a man who had run a county's economy like a personal instrument for 7 years, and had just discovered that the instrument had been quietly disassembled by people he'd underestimated. What Silas didn't know was that Bram Tolland was behind him. He hadn't heard the approach. Tolland was good at not being heard, and when he became aware of a presence at his left shoulder, his hand moved before his mind fully processed the situation, and then he stopped the movement because he recognized something in the quality of the stillness. Not threat. Something else. He turned. Tolland was standing 4 feet away, both hands visible, which was its own communication. He looked the same as the description Silas had built from other people's accounts, compact, weathered, 40-something, with the particular quality of a man who has made his living in a high-stakes profession and survived it by being genuinely careful rather than just appearing to be. I'm not here for Halberd, Tolland said immediately. His voice was quiet, designed to not carry. I figured, Silas said. Given that you turned down $10,000. Something moved in Tolland's face, not quite surprised, but close. You knew about that. Word travels. Tolland looked at the bank, at the men on the street, at the town arrayed around the fact of Garvey's presence, like a place that has been waiting for permission to be itself again. I heard there was a marshal, he said. I've been in the area. I thought he stopped. I thought I should be here, in case it went sideways. Silas looked at him. Why? Because I turned down the job, Tolland said, but that doesn't mean somebody else didn't take it. He paused. I've been watching Halberd's men since yesterday. Nobody he's hired in the past month is somebody I know, which means they're local or near local, which means they're not professionals. He said professionals without any vanity in it, just as a category. Unprofessionals make different mistakes than professionals. They don't think through consequences the same way. This goes sideways. It's not going to go sideways, Silas said. How sure are you? Silas looked at the bank door, at Caleb through the window, at the 2 men Halberd had left near the entrance, who were now watching both of them with the uncertain attention of people who have identified a new element in a situation they were already unsure how to manage. Less sure than I'd like, he said honestly. Tolland nodded. Then I'll stay. They stood together on the boardwalk, 2 old professionals in a town that was in the process of deciding its own future, and didn't say anything else for a while. Inside the bank, Halberd had elected to sit down. It was the right choice. Tactically, Garvey noted it and recalibrated slightly, because a man who sits down is a man who has decided to engage rather than obstruct, and engagement was manageable. Obstruction was longer and uglier, and ultimately arrived at the same place, but it created complications along the way. I want it understood, Halberd said, that some of what you're looking at reflects decisions made by bank staff operating outside my direct supervision. Dodd, Garvey said, among others. Dodd worked directly for your operation. His employment at the bank was arranged through a letter of recommendation that came from your lawyer, Reese, to the tax board. Garvey pulled one of Ferris's letters from the stack and set it in front of Halberd. This letter directs Ferris to ensure that the Gruber account shows a payment gap of at least 90 days in order to trigger the acceleration clause. It's on your letterhead. It's in your handwriting. The signature is yours, he paused. I've been doing this for 20 years, Mr. Halberd. I can read handwriting. Halberd looked at the letter. He looked at it for a long moment. Something went through his face that was not quite the collapse of a position, but was the first perceptible movement toward it, the moment when a carefully maintained wall registers its first crack, not visible to anyone watching casually, but real. I'd like to speak with my lawyer, he said. You're welcome to send for him, Garvey said. He can meet us at the land office. I'll be there for the next several hours reviewing property records. He began organizing the documents back into their stack, with the careful efficiency of a man who has done this before. You're not under arrest today, Mr. Halberd. I want that clear. This is a preliminary investigation, and you have rights within that process that I will respect. He looked at Halberd directly. But I want you to understand that the preliminary investigation has been ongoing for 11 days, and what I've seen in this bank this morning is consistent with what I've been reviewing for those 11 days. And the next steps are already in motion. Halberd stood, his chair scraped, he buttoned his coat. He was still controlled. Silas would have respected the control. Even now, the way you respect the architecture of a building, even when you understand it's going to come down. Nathan, he said, without looking at Cole. Nathan looked up. Halberd looked at him for a moment. Not threatening, that window had closed. Just looking, in the way a man looks at something that has surprised him. Because Nathan Cole keeping 4 years of records in a satchel had been, apparently, outside the range of what Halberd had thought was possible from a man with a son's loan to protect. He turned and walked out. Nathan sat for a moment after Halberd left. Then he put his face in his hands, briefly, the way people do when a thing they've been carrying finally puts itself down. Not crying, just the physical release of a sustained tension. Caleb at the door watched him without saying anything. All right? Garvey asked. Nathan took his hands from his face. Yes, he said. Yes, I'm all right. He wasn't entirely all right, but he was more all right than he'd been in 4 years. And that was a start. Halberd came out of the bank into a main street that had accumulated over the past hour, a quality of witness. Not a crowd. Red Mesa was not a large enough town for crowds, and the people on the street were doing ordinary things in ordinary ways. But there were more of them than would normally be on Main Street on a Tuesday morning, and they were staying, and they were watching. He saw Elena first. She was standing near the rail where her horse was tied, and she looked at him with the direct, unmanaged gaze she'd always had, and she didn't look away. Halberd held her gaze for a moment, and then moved his eyes forward. Walt Gruber was across the street, standing in front of the general store, arms at his sides, watching. Silas was on the boardwalk to his left, with a man Halberd didn't recognize standing beside him. Both of them still, both of them looking. Halberd's 2 men near the entrance fell in behind him as he walked toward his horse. He was aware of the street, of the watching, of the specific quality of it, not hostility, not celebration. Just the weight of a community seeing a thing clearly that it had been prevented from seeing clearly for a long time. It was, in its way, the thing he'd been most careful to prevent, and he had prevented it successfully for 7 years, and he was not preventing it now. He had almost reached his horse when Beaumont appeared. The sheriff came out of his office doorway and walked toward Halberd at a pace that was not urgent, but was not casual either. He was wearing his badge, which he always wore, but he was wearing it differently, not the way a man wears a coat he needs because it's cold, but the way a man wears a coat he chose because it was right. Silas noticed the difference from across the street. He suspected others noticed it too. Everett, Beaumont said. He hadn't called him Everett in years. He'd been saying Mr. Halberd since the mortgage. Halberd stopped. Sheriff. Garvey's going to need you available for the next few days, Beaumont said. I want you to understand that means available in Red Mesa, not available from a different county. Halberd looked at him. Something passed between them that had the weight of 9 years of a particular arrangement. 9 years of a man with a mortgage and a man who held the note and the understanding, never explicitly stated, of what that arrangement entailed. You're telling me not to leave, Halberd said. I'm asking you to stay, Beaumont said, as the county's law enforcement officer and as a courtesy from one person to another. He paused. The mortgage on my property, I'll be speaking to Garvey about the circumstances of that loan, and whether the terms I've been paying against are the terms I agreed to. He said it the way a man says something he's been working up to for a long time, not smoothly, with some roughness in it, but said, "I thought you should know." Halberd mounted his horse. His men mounted behind him. He looked down at Beaumont from the saddle, the elevated position, the practiced authority, and for the first time in as long as anyone watching could remember, the elevation didn't translate into the thing it usually translated into. He just looked like a man on a horse. He rode back toward the Rafter H. Silas watched him go. Toland, beside him, watched too. When the Rafter H riders were at the far end of Main Street, Toland said, "That's not finished." "No," Silas agreed. "He'll regroup. He'll talk to lawyers. He'll try to find a procedural angle that Garvey missed." "He'll try," Silas said. "But he's doing it now with his name on a territorial investigation, and 6 people who are no longer isolated from each other, and a marshal who's seen the documents." He paused. "The architecture is gone. Even if he finds procedural angles, he's building from rubble." Toland was quiet for a moment. "Then you planned this from the gate." "From before the gate," Silas said. "From when Clara wrote me the letter. I just needed to understand what was actually here before I knew what to do with it." 6 people, Toland said. "Against a man with 3,000 acres and a purchased bank and 9 years of positioned leverage." 6 honest people, Silas said. "That's different from 6 people." He pulled his coat tighter against the morning cold. Honest people, when you connect them to each other, become something Halberd's type of operation doesn't have a good answer for, because his entire system runs on isolation, on each person believing they're alone in the problem. He looked down the street, at Elena talking to Walt, at Caleb coming out of the bank, with the particular expression of a young man who has done the thing he was afraid to do and found out it was survivable. Connect them, and the isolation ends. And without the isolation, the leverage evaporates. Toland thought about this. That's a long way to get from opening a gate with a pry bar. The gate was the easy part, Silas said. He went to find Garvey. The next several hours had the quality of machinery engaging, not dramatic, not cinematic, but methodical in the way that actual consequences were methodical when they finally arrived. Garvey spent 3 hours at the land office with Silas and Caleb and the county's property records, cross-referencing the transaction history of every property Halberd had acquired against the loan records Nathan had provided. Pattern, laid out across 7 years of documentation, was not subtle. It was the kind of pattern that a territorial court would not need to strain to see. Ferris arrived at the land office at noon, which was 45 minutes after Garvey had gotten there, and had therefore lost the opportunity to shape the initial conversation, which Silas suspected was intentional on Garvey's part starting at the land office, rather than the bank had been, in retrospect. A decision that put Ferris 45 minutes behind where he needed to be. Ferris argued for 2 hours. Garvey listened to all of it with the patience of a man who has heard the same arguments in different county offices and knows what to do with them. Silas left the land office at 2 in the afternoon, because his role in what was happening inside it was marginal, and because he had understood something in the past hour that required his attention. He went to find Halberd's men, the ones who'd been pulled back from Main Street to the edges of town, and he walked past them slowly, counting, noting positions. 9 men, as Pruitt had said. Then he walked back to where Toland was still maintaining a quiet presence near the bank. 7 of them are watching this building, Silas said. 2 near the land office. None watching the road. Toland looked at him. He's not running. He's waiting for something. Silas thought about what that something might be. Halberd had gone back to the Rafter H. Ferris was at the land office, arguing. Procedural approach was in motion. But 7 men watching the bank was not a procedural posture, it was a contingency. He's waiting to see whether Garvey finds something specific, Toland said, and Silas could see by his expression that he was thinking it through as he said it. Something that's not in Nathan's records. Something that's still at the bank. Silas went back inside the bank. Nathan was still there, going through records with one of Garvey's deputies. "Nathan," Silas said. "The records room. It's in there that wasn't in your satchel." Nathan looked up. He thought for a moment. The original deed transfers. The property acquisition records from before I started at the bank. "Before you started," Silas said, 6 years ago. The first 2 years of Halberd's expansion. Before I was hired. Whatever happened in those 2 years is in the bank's archive, in the records room, and I've never had cause to review it because it predates my tenure. Nathan paused. "I don't know what's in those files, Silas. I genuinely don't." Silas looked at the records room door. "Is there a deputy inside this building?" "In the front office," Nathan said. Silas went to the deputy and said, There are documents in the records room that may be relevant to Garvey's investigation, and that haven't been reviewed yet. I want you to secure that room and send word to Garvey." The deputy looked at him. "And you are?" "The person who connected 6 honest people and made this morning possible," Silas said. "Ask Caleb Ward if you need a reference." The deputy secured the records room. He sent his partner for Garvey. Garvey arrived from the land office 20 minutes later, looked at what was in the archive, and was quiet for a long time. What was in the archive was the documentation of how Halberd had acquired the Rafter H itself, a transaction 10 years ago, involving a family named Castillo, whose ranch had been the foundation of the entire operation. The acquisition price, the loan terms that had preceded it, the notations in a hand that wasn't Nathan's and wasn't Dodd's and wasn't anyone currently employed by the bank, but which matched the handwriting on 3 of Ferris's letters precisely. Pattern didn't begin with Halberd's expansion. The pattern was Halberd's expansion. It went back to the very beginning, to the foundation, to the ranch itself. "This changes the scope," Garvey said. Not to anyone particularly, just noted. Silas had been standing in the doorway of the records room for the past 10 minutes. He thought about the Castillo family, whoever they were, wherever they'd gone when they lost the land that became the Rafter H. He thought about 10 years of something built on a wrong foundation, and how far a wrongness like that traveled outward through the years and the lives it touched. He thought about Walt's tin box and Elena's forged claws and Nathan's satchel and 12-year-old Tommy Hennessy delivering a folded note in his boot. He stepped back from the doorway and let Garvey work. Outside, through the bank window, he could see Main Street settling into its late afternoon quiet. The gathered witnesses had dispersed to their own business, their own ranches, their own suppers. The 2 men Halberd had left near the bank were still there, but they'd shifted from watchful to merely present, the way men shift when they've been standing in one place for too long, and the thing they were watching for has already happened, without them being able to stop it. Elena was still at the rail. She hadn't left. She was reading something, a letter, or maybe just a piece of paper. Silas couldn't tell from this distance, and she had the posture of a woman who has decided to remain where she is until she knows how the day ends, which Silas recognized as the same posture he'd been carrying for 30 years, and which he found, seeing it in someone else, to be something that looked less like stubbornness from the outside and more like a particular form of faith in the value of staying. He went out and stood beside her. She folded the paper. "What happened in there?" "Garvey found the beginning," he said. "Castillo acquisition, before Nathan's time." She was quiet for a moment. "Then it's bigger than what we built." "Yes." "Is that good or bad?" "Thought about it honestly." "It's more complicated," he said. "More complicated usually means longer, but it also means more complete." He looked at the bank. Whatever Halberd tries next, he's not doing it from a position of strength anymore. He lost that this morning. She looked at him. "What does he try next?" "Something that doesn't go through the legal system," Toland said from behind them both. "Turn." He was standing at the edge of the boardwalk, looking down the road in the direction of the Rafter H, with the particular focused quality of a man who has spent 20 years professionally anticipating what people do when their options narrow. A man like Halberd, when the legal architecture falls, he doesn't adapt to the new structure immediately. He tries to reassert the old one by force, because the old one is the only one where he has an advantage. He paused. He's got 9 men in this town and 7 more at the ranch, and he just spent 3 hours watching a territorial marshal walk into his operation and start dismantling it. The 3 of them stood in the cooling afternoon. Silas said, "Tonight." "That would be my red," Toland said. Elena looked between them. "What do we do?" Silas pulled his coat against the cold. He looked at Garvey's horse, tied at the rail, and the deputy standing at the bank door, and the land office where Ferris's arguments were presumably still running out of places to go, and the ordinary, battered, resilient surface of a town that had been living under a thing for 7 years, and had today seen the first real crack in it. "We make sure that whatever he tries," Silas said, "he doesn't try it in the dark, where nobody can see what happens." He went to find Beaumont. Beaumont was in his office when Silas found him, and he'd clearly been there for a while. The lamp was lit against the early dark, and there were papers on his desk that he'd been working through with the focused attention of a man who has decided to do something and is now figuring out the full scope of what that thing requires. He looked up when Silas came in, and what was in his face wasn't the complicated, suspended expression of the past several weeks. It was something simpler, tired, but simpler. "I've been going through my own files," Beaumont said. He didn't sound defensive about it. 3 years of things I saw and documented, and then put away because I didn't know what to do with them. He looked at the papers. Turns out I was keeping records too. Just not as organized as Cole's. Silas sat down. "That's useful." "I don't know what it is yet," Beaumont said honestly. "But it's something." He leaned back in his chair. "You came to tell me tonight is the problem." "Tolland thinks so." "Think so, Tolland." Beaumont said the name with a particular weight. "Bram Tolland is in Red Mesa. He turned down Halberd's job 6 weeks ago. He's been in the area since." Beaumont processed this. "And you trust him?" "I trust his read on what Halberd does when legal options close," Silas said. "He's spent 20 years working for men like Halberd. He knows the pattern." "What does the pattern look like tonight?" "Halberd rides in with his men, not to conduct business. Demonstrate that the investigation doesn't change what he is in this county, and that the people who cooperated with it should understand that." Silas paused. "He won't come openly violent if he can avoid it. He'll come in force, make himself visible, let the weight of it do the work. But if someone steps out to confront him, it goes sideways," Beaumont said. "Goes sideways," Silas confirmed. "And in the dark, away from Garvey's official presence, sideways is where Halberd is most comfortable." Beaumont was quiet for a moment, looking at his hands on the desk. The hands of a man who'd worn a badge for 11 years and had spent the last several of them avoiding the full weight of what the badge meant. "What do you need from me?" "Garvey needs to know tonight is coming," Silas said. "That comes better from you than from me. You're the county's law enforcement officer. If you walk into the land office and tell a territorial marshal that you have reason to believe a property owner is planning an intimidation action against cooperative witnesses, that's a formal communication that gives Garvey standing to respond officially." He paused. "If I walk in and say the same thing, it's an old man speculating." Beaumont almost smiled at that. Almost. He stood, picked up his hat. "All right," he said. "Let's go talk to Garvey." Garvey listened to Beaumont's account with the same focused, economical attention he brought to everything. And when Beaumont was done, he asked 3 specific questions: how many men, what were their likely positions, and what was the physical layout of Main Street between the bank and the land office. Then he sent his 2 deputies to positions he chose based on the answers, and he went back to the archive documents, because Garvey was, at his core, a man who understood that the best response to tonight was making sure that tomorrow's legal case was airtight enough that whatever happened tonight couldn't destabilize it. Silas respected that. He went to find Tolland. Tolland was where he'd been for most of the afternoon, moving, unhurried, around the perimeter of the town's central block, maintaining visibility in a way that communicated presence without aggression. He was good at it. Silas fell into step beside him. "Beaumont told Garvey," Silas said. "I saw them go in together," Tolland said. "That's a different Beaumont than the one who's been here for 3 years. People move when they're ready to move," Silas said. "Can't make them ready. You can only make sure they have something to move toward." They walked for a moment in silence, past the general store, past the saloon where the evening's activity was beginning to assert itself through the lit windows, past the alley between the hardware store and the feed merchant, where one of Garvey's deputies was positioned with the particular stillness of someone who was there to see rather than to be seen. The night was cold and clear, the kind of cold that carried sound farther than it would otherwise travel, which was both an advantage and a problem depending on which direction the sound was coming from. "How do you want to play this?" Tolland asked. "I don't want to play it at all," Silas said. "I want Halberd to ride in, see that the town is awake, and Garvey's people are positioned, and Beaumont is the street with his badge on, and I want him to make the calculation that tonight is not the night and ride back." He paused. "That's what I want. And if he doesn't make that calculation, then we deal with what actually happens instead of what I want." Tolland nodded. He understood the distinction perfectly. In his line of work, the gap between what you planned for and what actually happened was where most of the damage occurred, and the best you could do was stay honest about the gap, rather than collapsing it by pretending your plan was the same as reality. They positioned themselves near the north end of Main Street, where the road from the Rafter H came into town. Not blocking it, just present. Clara came out of the boarding house at 8 o'clock with 2 cups of coffee and handed one to Silas without comment. He took it. She went back inside. That was Clara, no ceremony, no unnecessary conversation. Just the practical recognition that a man standing in the cold for an undetermined period of time needed something warm in his hands. Walt showed up at 8:30. He didn't ask where to stand. He found a position near the saloon, visible from the north road, and stood there. Elena rode in at 8:45 and tied her horse at the rail in front of Clara's and came to stand near Silas, close enough for conversation, but not so close that it looked like clustering. "You should be at the ranch," Silas said. "My ranch is 30 minutes south," she said. "If Halberd decides the ranch is the easier target tonight, 30 minutes is 30 minutes. Being here or not being here doesn't change that." She looked at him. "And I'd rather be here." He didn't argue. She was right on the arithmetic, and she was right on the other thing too, the thing underneath the arithmetic, the thing that said, "This is my town and I will be present in it on the night it decides what it is." Caleb was on the street with his badge visible. Nathan Cole had gone home. Garvey had told him to, reasonably, because Nathan's role in what came next was legal and documentary rather than physical, and there was no good reason for him to be on Main Street at night. Diego Reyes, the ranch hand who'd witnessed the meeting 3 years ago and had been carrying that knowledge without knowing what to do with it, was near the hardware store. He'd showed up without being asked, which meant someone had talked to him, or he'd simply understood that tonight was the kind of night when a person needed to make a choice about where they stood, and he'd made it. At 9:15 they heard the horses. Halberd came with 11 men. Not the 17 that Silas had feared at one point, but 11, which was still more than the street's current population of witnesses and considerably more than Garvey's 2 deputies. He rode at the front, not because he was strategically the right person to be at the front, but because he was Everett Halberd, and he had never, in 20 years of doing what he did, ridden anywhere other than the front. Pulled up at the north end of Main Street and looked at what was there. Beaumont on the street, badge on. Caleb Ward, 20 feet south, badge on. Garvey's deputy visible at the alley edge. Not concealed, not stepping forward, just visible. Walt Gruber near the saloon. Diego Reyes near the hardware store. Elena Crow at the rail in front of the boarding house. Silas on the boardwalk with an empty coffee cup, looking at him with the same calm that had been, from the first day, the most disorienting thing about the man, the calm that didn't read as unconcerned, but as past concerned, as having already moved through every version of this moment and arrived at something on the other side of it. And Tolland, standing in the lamplight near the north end of the street, in a position that put him between Halberd's men and everything south of him, not drawing attention to himself, just there, in the way that men who are very good at what they do are there as a fact rather than a statement. Halberd looked at Tolland for a long moment. Tolland looked back. Whatever passed between them in that moment was the accumulated communication of 2 men who existed in the same professional world and understood each other's capabilities without sentimentality about it. Pruitt, behind Halberd's right shoulder, said something quietly. Halberd didn't respond to it visibly. Beaumont walked forward. Not fast, not slow, the walk of a man doing his job. He stopped 15 feet from Halberd's horse and looked up at him. "Everett," he said. "It's late." "I'm aware of the time," Halberd said. "Town's settled for the night," Beaumont said. "Garvey's people are around. Whatever you came to do, this isn't the right time for it." "Came to see my town," Halberd said. And there was something in the way he said "my town" that was different from how he'd said it before. Not different in the words, but different underneath them, the way a wall sounds different when you knock on it after the support has been removed. He still said it. He just couldn't make it land the same way. "It's been a long day," Beaumont said. "For everybody." A long pause. Halberd's horse shifted its weight. One of the 11 men behind him coughed. The night was cold and clear, and the lamplight on the street caught the edges of things: badge, rein, boot, the line of Walt Gruber's shoulders, the particular set of Tolland's posture. Then Bram Tolland spoke, and what he said was not loud, not theatrical, just clearly audible in the quiet street. "Dell," he said, looking at Pruitt. "You're a smart man. Talk to him." Pruitt looked at Tolland. He looked at the street. He looked at Garvey's deputy at the alley edge, and the second deputy who had appeared, silently, at the south end of the street in the past 5 minutes. He looked at Caleb Ward and Beaumont, and the small, stubborn gathering of people who had decided tonight was not a night to be absent from their own town. He said something to Halberd in a voice too low to carry. Whatever he said, Halberd heard it. Halberd looked at the street one more time. Silas one more time. Silas looked back, same as always, without heat, without triumph, with the patience of a man who has already paid most of his costs and is not in a hurry about the remainder. Halberd turned his horse. His 11 men turned with him. They rode back up the North Road, and the sound of them faded into the dark and then was gone, and Main Street exhaled. No one cheered. That was the thing Silas noticed, the absence of celebration, which was its own kind of wisdom in a town that had been through enough to understand that the departure of Halberd's horses was not the end of anything but the beginning of a different kind of work. Walt went back to the saloon. Diego Reyes went home. Elena untied her horse and led it toward the livery without fanfare. Caleb came to where Silas was standing and said, "He'll come back through lawyers." "Yes," Silas said. "That's where Garvey lives. Let him." The territorial investigation ran for 11 weeks. Silas stayed in Red Mesa for 9 of them, which was 8.5 weeks longer than he'd planned when he saddled Ash and rode west in response to Clara's letter. He stayed because the process required witnesses and documentation, and the occasional human presence of someone who could explain, in plain language, the sequence of events to a territorial court examiner who needed the narrative as well as the records. He stayed because Caleb needed someone to think out loud with when the legal proceedings took turns that were confusing. He stayed because Elena's fence needed more work than she could do, alone in November, and because he was there and had hands, and it seemed like the right use of a morning. He was aware, across those 9 weeks, that he was also staying, because it was the first place in years where the thing he carried the Dredge Creek weight, the 19-year-old's decision in bad light that had killed an innocent man, felt like something that had been transformed into something usable, not resolved. He didn't think it would ever be resolved, and he'd stopped expecting resolution the way you stopped expecting rain in a drought, not because the need for it went away, but because spending energy expecting the wrong thing was wasteful. But the weight of it had been put to work here, in a specific place, among specific people, and there was something in that which was quieter than anything he'd felt in a long time. Halberd's legal team filed 4 motions in the first 3 weeks. Garvey's documentation combined with the Castillo acquisition records from the archive and Beaumont's own files and the formal testimony of Walt and Elena and Nathan and Diego defeated all 4. The 5th motion was withdrawn by Ferris before filing, which Garvey described to Silas as a reliable indicator that the defense had looked at the full weight of evidence and made an honest calculation. The territorial court issued its finding in the 12th week. Everett Halberd was formally charged with loan fraud, document alteration, coercive business practices, and illegal road closure charges whose combined weight made the possibility of maintaining the Rafter H operation, while simultaneously managing a territorial criminal proceeding essentially impossible. Castillo finding added a separate inquiry into the original acquisition, which brought in a different court and a different timeline, and effectively doubled the legal exposure. He did not stand trial immediately. The legal machinery moved at its own pace, which was slower than justice ideally would be, and faster than Halberd had apparently expected, given the complexity of his procedural defenses. But what happened in the weeks following the court's finding was perhaps more significant than whatever verdict would eventually arrive. The Banks Board, presented with Nathan Cole's documentation and the court's preliminary findings, removed Halberd's informal influence from the institution and began a review of every loan that had been managed under his direction. Walt Gruber's cash payment appeared, once the right person looked for it. Elena's loan was reviewed against the unaltered original. Beaumont's mortgage was identified as one of 12 that showed evidence of unauthorized term modification. Road 7 reopened the day after the court's finding. Not ceremonially, one of Garvey's deputies simply removed the padlock and gate and stacked the hardware at the side of the road. Walt heard about it that evening and rode out the next morning with his cattle. He came back in the late afternoon with the look of a man who has done something so ordinary that the ordinariness of it was itself moving, just moved cattle down the road they'd always used to get to market. Nothing more than that. Nothing more than what should always have been available to him. Silas left on a Wednesday morning in late January, which was not a morning he'd planned for specifically, but which arrived with the quality of the right moment, one of those mornings, when the thing you've been doing has reached its own natural pause, and the next part of it will happen without you, as it should. He saddled Ash at the livery in the early cold. Clara came down from the boarding house in her coat and watched him without making a production of it, which was appropriate, because making a production of things was not who either of them was. "Where are you going?" she asked. "East, probably," he said. "Nothing specific. You never have anything specific." "I have Ash," he said. "That's usually enough." She looked at the horse, who was regarding the morning with his standard expression of deep equine indifference. "Come back if you need to," she said. "Not come back and visit, not you're always welcome, just the plain acknowledgement that the door was not closing. Clara." She communicated in the minimum necessary words and trusted you to understand the rest. Elena came to the livery before he'd finished his preparations. She came on horseback, which meant she'd ridden in from the ranch at dawn, specifically, and she tied up at the rail and came inside and looked at him with that direct, undecorated gaze. "I wanted to be here," she said, "before you left." He nodded. She was quiet for a moment, which was the silence of someone organizing what they actually want to say rather than what comes automatically. James used to say, "She started, then stopped. Try it again." He used to say that the land didn't belong to you. You belonged to it temporarily, and your job was to take care of it well enough that the next person who came to it found it better than you did. She paused. "I've been thinking about that, about what you did here. It's the same idea." He thought about it. Maybe, he said. He wasn't sure he'd put it that way. He wasn't sure he'd put it anyway, particularly. What he'd done had not felt like philosophy while he was doing it. It had felt like a series of decisions, each one made with imperfect information in real time, most of them correct enough, a few of them wrong in ways that had required adjustment. The result of those decisions was something that would outlast his presence in Red Mesa, which was probably the best thing you could say about any series of decisions. "Take this," Elena said. She held out a folded piece of paper. Took it. He looked at her, questioning. "It's the deed to the 40 acres on the north boundary of the Crow Ranch," she said. "James bought it separately, before we were married, and it's been sitting in the title records without being used. Good grazing land. Water access." She paused. "I'm not offering it as payment. I know you don't want payment. I'm offering it as a place, in case you ever want one." He held the paper for a moment. He thought about 40 acres of good grazing land with water access. He thought about Ash, who was old enough now to deserve a fence line he didn't have to travel past. He thought about what it meant to have a place, not a destination you were riding toward, but an actual fixed point on a map that had your name attached to it. "Think about it," he said. He put the paper in his coat pocket next to the folded spot where Clara's letter had lived for 3 days before he'd saddled up and ridden west. He finished saddling Ash, led him out into the cold morning, and mounted with the careful deliberateness of a man whose joints remembered every mile they'd covered. Walt was at the end of Main Street when he rode through, standing in front of the general store with a cup of something hot, and he raised it in a small gesture as Silas passed. Silas raised a hand. That was the whole of it. Caleb was outside the sheriff's office, his office. Now, technically, since Beaumont had filed his resignation 2 weeks into the investigation, and the county had appointed Caleb acting sheriff while the formal process moved forward. Caleb looked different than the young deputy who'd brushed his horse in the livery while confessing to a near stranger that he had a sister to protect and fear to manage. Not older, exactly. Just fuller. Like a person who has discovered that doing the thing they were afraid to do produces a person they didn't know they could be. "Silas," he said, "Caleb. I've been trying to think of something worth saying." "You don't need to say anything," Silas said. "I know, but I want to." He paused. "Before you got here, I knew the right thing to do. I just couldn't figure out how to be the kind of person who did it. And then you showed up and opened a gate with a pry bar, and somehow that was enough. I've been trying to understand why that was enough. And I think," he stopped, "I think sometimes people just need to see someone act like the right thing is obvious, even when it isn't, especially when it isn't." Silas sat with that for a moment on Ash's back. He thought about whether it was true. He thought it probably was, in the way that simple things were often true not universally, not without exception, but true enough to be useful. He'd spent most of his adult life believing that the right thing was complicated, which it often was. But the acting of it, when it came down to it, was frequently the simplest part. You opened the gate. You introduced the isolated people to each other. You told the truth about Dredge Creek to a woman who deserved to know it before she decided whether to trust you. You stayed when the staying mattered, and you left when the leaving was the right thing. "Take care of your sister," Silas said. Caleb nodded. "She started helping Nathan at the bank. He needed someone organized." Silas almost smiled. "Good." He touched his hat and rode. He was 3 miles east of Red Mesa, past the canyon, its empty silence. Halberd's 7 men long gone from its walls when he reached into his coat pocket and took out Elena's folded deed. He looked at it for a moment, riding Ash, picking his way at his own pace along the road. 40 acres, water access, good grazing land. He thought about what it meant to be 62 years old, and to have spent 40 of those years moving through a country that was large enough that you could avoid staying anywhere, long enough to know what staying felt like. He thought about the weight he'd been carrying since Dredge Creek, and about Clara's observation that the carrying of it had brought him here, and about whether that was a thing you could put down now, or whether it was simply part of you in the way that an old break in a shoulder was part of you, not something that could be undone, but something that you'd learn to compensate for until the compensating became just the way you moved. He thought about James Crow buying 40 acres separately, before a marriage, and what that said about the kind of man James had been, a man who understood that good land was its own kind of care, that taking care of something well enough for the next person was its own kind of legacy. He put the deed back in his pocket. He didn't turn around. Kept riding east, Ash moving steadily under him. The cold January light flat and clear across the land. The road ahead of him empty, in the good way that roads could be empty, not desolate. Just open, the way a page is open before you decide what to write on it. He didn't know yet whether he'd go back to Elena's 40 acres. He didn't know what came next in any specific sense. What he knew was what he always knew, which was the immediate thing. The road, the horse, the cold, the next mile. But the deed was in his pocket. That was new. He'd carried Clara's letter for 3 days before deciding to act on it. Maybe he'd carry the deed for a while and see what happened. That seemed right. That seemed like the kind of decision a person made when they were no longer in a hurry about what came next, because what came next was going to be what it was going to be, and the only real question was whether you were honest about it when it arrived. Canyon fell behind him. Red Mesa fell behind him. Ash walked east at his own unhurried pace, and the country opened up ahead flat, then rolling, then the distant suggestion of hills that were weeks away if he chose to ride toward them. He didn't choose yet. He just rode. What happened to Red Mesa after Silas left was not the story of a town that was saved and therefore became perfect. Towns don't work that way. The Halberd trial ground through the territorial court system for 14 months and produced a verdict that satisfied no one completely, as most verdicts don't, but that resulted in the dissolution of the illegal loan structures, the return of the Castillo family's purchase price with interest in a settlement negotiated by Garvey's office, and a criminal conviction on 3 of the 7 original charges, the others having been reduced or dismissed on grounds that were procedurally defensible, even when they were morally unsatisfying. Walt got his cattle back. Elena's loan was restructured at the original terms, which made her payments manageable in a way they hadn't been for 2 years. Nathan Cole stayed at the bank and became, over the following years, the kind of banker that people trusted, not because he was perfect, but because he'd proven, at some cost, that he understood the difference between doing his job and doing what he was told. Caleb Ward was formally elected sheriff in the spring, which he won by a margin that surprised him, and surprised nobody else who'd been paying attention. Bram Tolland rode out, the day after Silas, in a different direction, toward whatever the next work was. He didn't say much when he left. He'd said what he had to say that night on Main Street, to Del Pruitt, in a voice too quiet to carry far but loud enough to matter. Clara kept the boarding house. She kept making good coffee. She wrote Silas a letter 6 months after he left, to an address he'd given her in a town 2 days east, and the letter was characteristically brief. The road's still open. The bank is better. Caleb figured out how to wear the badge like it fits. Thought you'd want to know. Then Elena's north fence is holding. He wrote back. He said the road from his end was also open, which was not a metaphor and was also a metaphor. He said he was in good health, that Ash was in adequate health, and that he'd decided something. He didn't say what he'd decided. Clara, reading the letter, understood anyway. She folded it and put it in the kitchen drawer, where she kept things worth keeping. Because here is the truth about what happened in Red Mesa, the actual truth, underneath the legal findings and the loan restructurings, and the formal machinery of accountability that ground forward on its own timeline. The truth was that a group of people who had been told, through 7 years of careful pressure, that they were alone in their problems, discovered that they were not alone, that the isolation was not a fact about the world, but a specific manufactured tool designed to make each person's problem feel individual, and therefore insoluble. And once they saw the tool for what it was, the tool stopped working. That's how it worked, mostly. That's how it worked there. and how it works in other places where the same kind of wrong takes root not through one dramatic act of resistance, though the dramatic moments matter. Through ordinary people discovering that their ordinary courage, when connected to other people's ordinary courage, becomes something that a man with 3,000 acres and a purchased bank and 9 years of positioned leverage has no real answer for. Silas Vane opened a gate with a pry bar, saw some boardwalks and drank bad coffee, and asked careful questions, and told the truth about Dredge Creek to a woman who deserved to hear it. He introduced 6 honest people to each other, and let what naturally happened between honest people who knew they were not alone do the rest of the work. That was all. That was everything. He was 62 years old, with a bad shoulder and an old gray horse and a folded deed in his coat pocket, to 40 acres of good land with water access. He had spent 40 years carrying a weight that would not dissolve, but had found, in these 9 weeks, that the carrying of it could be transformed into something that moved in the right direction. The road east was open. The land ahead was open. Ash walked at his own pace, and Silas led him. Because Ash had always known how fast was right, and at some point in 11 years you learned to trust a thing that had never once given you a reason not to. The legend of Red Mesa, if there was one, was not the old man who rode in and opened a locked gate and stayed long enough to see the town remember what it was. That was just one man doing what he could with what he had, which is all any person ever does. The legend, if towns could have legends, which they could, in the quiet way that places absorb the things that happened in them and carry them forward, was the 6 people who said yes when it mattered. The woman who kept her dead husband's loan records and refused a lowball offer on good land. The banker who filled a satchel for 4 years and waited for a moment worth using it. The rancher with his tin box. The deputy who finally wore his badge like it belonged to him. The sheriff who said Everett instead of Mr. Halberd and meant something by it. 12-year-old boy who delivered a note in his boot and asked no questions because his mother said it was important. The legend was them, it always is. Silas Vane rode east. The deed stayed in his pocket. The road from Red Mesa stayed open, as roads should be, as they always should have been, which is such an ordinary thing that you forget to notice it until someone tries to take it away.